Welcome back to the channel. This is Trendy Storm and you are watching first part of What If Naruto Was Left Behind by Jiraiya during 3 years training trip. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Always wasting no more time. Let's start the story.
3 months into Naruto and Jiraiya's training trip, one thing started. One of the Konoha spymaster's spies in Tsuchi no Kuni sent him an urgent message. Naruto had no idea what it was about, and the pervert would not explain why. If all went well, he had been left on his own and, more significantly, without any training for 2 whole months. The lazy pervert refused to cough up even that much, so he had no idea why Jiraiya had refused to take him along. He claimed that Iwa was dangerous, but how could it be more so than Mizu no Kuni? They had been there before, and there were a lot of crazy people there. Naruto had his reasons for holding this unforgiving view, and poor Haku wasn't the only one. He had created several shadow clones in his first week in the country to assist a fish merchant in pulling his cart out of a ravine it had fallen into. The merchant offered him protection money, and when Naruto declined, he pleaded for his life, fearing that he had offended him. In Naruto's view, any place where being kind to others elicited such a response had to be completely broken, and that was just the start of it all. After ruffling Naruto's hair and saying, "At least this is far from anywhere important, even you can't make too much trouble here," Jiraiya caused him to swat the hand away and huff in outrage. "Just so you know, that swamp village thing wasn't my fault. I don't care if they were high and mighty Kiri Chunin, nobody demands protection money from little flower girls. She was 10 years old, for heaven's sake." He argued yes, he had been impacted by that nation, but not in the way Naruto would express it in a polite setting. However, polite company had nothing to do with Jiraiya. Those syphilic bastards of a plucked vulture and oyster with the shits, and they got their spines from the oyster, and the vulture was a whore. He didn't have to resort to uncreative 4-letter words, which was a benefit of the time he was compelled to waste in every red light district they encountered. Jiraiya managed to say, "If you say so," and Naruto was certain that the pause in his voice was a swallowed laugh because of this. The subsequent lecture about being unobtrusive was less than effective. The southern tea country was home to the beach town of Makima. Since fire was the only nation tea shared a land border with, and it was roughly as far away as they could go from rain and sound, Naruto was certain they were indeed there, even though Jiraiya stated he needed to check in with his informants there. He was able to read maps with ease. "Thank you very much." Makimura's sunny, temperate climate drew visitors from all over the continent. Long golden beaches, a lovely promenade along the sea with upscale hotels, restaurants, and shops, a war monument honoring the victims of a historic civil war, numerous large shrines, and, of course, a sizable red light district with tea houses, geisha houses, simple whorehouses, bars, and casinos were all part of it. Naruto was not surprised to learn that the safe house Jiraiya had hidden him in was located in the far corner of the red light district, huddled between the seashore and the wall enclosing the garden of a geisha house. Despite its small size, it had a decent appearance. He looked knowingly at the garden behind the high wall and said, "What, no back gate?" Jiraiya gave him a head thud. Jiraiya gave Naruto the merchant's contact details and codes, and the codes he would recognize from his backup/babysitter. "Behave, you. There's food for a week stored inside, be mindful of the traps. Your cover's a worker for one of the local merchants, he's my contact. I'll send someone from Konoha to help you stay undercover and keep an eye on you." He then departed, leaving Naruto to sort out the traps that had prevented the house in such a neighborhood from being damaged. After spending 30 minutes figuring out how to break through the door's seal, Naruto was left hanging upside down from the ceiling after being scratched by one of the poisonous kunai. The poisoning still caused his urine to turn blue and his tongue to turn purple, but Kyuubi took care of it. It was Naruto's first time spending an afternoon alone in the big world. Long before Naruto was even a genin, there was another beginning. The beginning before beginning. Naruto was unaware that anything had begun at the beginning. 2 fugitives from Kirigakure's graduation were on the run, so another beginning turned out to be a middle. The oldest daughter of a well-known Kiri ninja family was Mizushima Konatsu. Her uncles, aunts, and both of her parents were Junin, and she was praised as a prodigy. No one ever doubted that she would graduate because she was excellent at kenjutsu and genjutsu, proficient in ninjutsu and taijutsu, and mediocre at gathering information. With her deep gray eyes and black hair, she was also stunning. She was one of those people who had everything. She was wealthy and had already received 2 proposals for her hand in marriage. Kaide was a different matter. After his mother died, he signed up for ninja life because it was the only way to avoid living on the streets. He was an orphan without a name or clan. Thanks to Konatsu's tutoring, he managed to stay in the middle of the pack and was a decent student who didn't really stand out in anything. His teachers didn't really expect him to survive, and he was regularly teased because of his feminine name. His sole advantage was that he was Konatsu's half-brother, and although she wasn't supposed to care about her father's jerkish son, she was very concerned. As a result of Kirigakir's one-on-one death-defying competitions for graduating students, Konatsu and Kaide ended up standing at opposite ends of a vacant room. Konatsu pondered whether her father had orchestrated this, for Konatsu to take the life of the son he had never recognized and never desired. Though Konatsu couldn't see his face, she believed that the proctor's shoulders and head tilt conveyed sympathy as he watched Kaide while he stood with his back to her, repeating the rules. She stabbed the chunin from behind because she couldn't afford to show sympathy. They then stole as much food as they could carry, raided the academy kitchen for as much food as they could carry, and fled for their lives after searching his pockets for cash. Amazingly, they entered a seaport and boarded the first ship to depart. It was on its way to a resort town in the tea country. Konatsu smiled and assured her brother, "We will be all right. I promise I'll protect you as long as we have each other. It's going to be just fine." But she was secretly fuming at her own helplessness. She was aware that their success thus far was a miracle. "I know," Kaide said with a sickly smile. He was aware of how improbable that was, for the most part, but also because of the sickening, rolling way the ship bobbed up and down on the waves. However, one day was more than one day, and they would have already cast him into the icy depths of Kiri if Konatsu hadn't been there. He hoped for a miracle because there was still life, and hope always exists after all. One miracle had already occurred. The beginning of one end was marked by Mizuki's admission of betrayal after his incarceration. His lover, Ono Tsubaki, a devoted Konohagakure kunoichi and a kind, warm woman, found herself in a very tough situation. The denial stage was the first. She assumed there must have been a mistake, that he could never. But he did, and she had no idea why. Was it for financial gain? Had he become so unhappy as an academy teacher, and what was it that Konoha couldn't provide but Orochimaru could? As her lover, what was so much more important than life as a valuable Konoha shinobi? Did he not give a damn? Soon after denial, there was anger. Angry at him for leaving her, for spitting at her trust and love, and for leaving her to bear the consequences of his actions. She was shunned by her fellow villagers for the first few weeks. She was tarred with the same brush as Mizuki, who, for whatever reason, had sold them out. They had good reason to be concerned. She knew that. She might have been an accomplice, a spy who continued to operate after he was apprehended, or he might have confided in her. She had been the person closest to him, so she was the most likely to notice that something wasn't right. She didn't feel any better knowing this. Even after being found not guilty, she still had a black mark on her record because of the intense interrogation she endured. It wasn't in any official documents, but it was in people's thoughts, and she probably wouldn't have made a Junin if she hadn't already. Even though Iruka was in a better position than she was, she told Amino Iruka, Mizuki's former best friend and comrade in this mess, "I have been thinking, maybe that was why he turned the way he did. I mean, I'm well aware it isn't an excuse, but I just feel the need to understand even a little. After all, it was he who had captured Mizuki. He was suspected when that missing nin killed his teammate with his kunai, and even though he was found innocent, the suspicion lingered about for years and blocked a lot of advancement prospects. That might well have been the start, and it's a reason, but you were right, it isn't an excuse. If we excused him because he was treated unfairly, we would do grave disservice to those who also suffer prejudice, but never lose their integrity," replied Iruka. It didn't take a genius to figure out who Iruka was thinking of while they were eating ramen at Ichiraku's. Shame burned in her head and the ramen broth's heat burned on her tongue. It is true that she had never been cruel to Uzumaki Naruto, but she had also never been cruel to him in any other way. He shouldn't have needed her to give him the benefit of the doubt. Only now, following his valor in the Chunin exam invasion and his successful recovery of the Godem Hokage, were people starting to view their Jinchuriki more favorably. Tsubaki, who had experienced the same bitter medication, wished she had at least once used a kind word with the boy. She had had to learn the hard way how important those were. She was even past the idea that everything was just some bad dream or even enemy genjutsu, which she had negotiated with any higher power that might listen. All she was depressed. Iruka questioned her, "Have you considered a change of scenery?" Halfway between the bowl and her mouth, she noticed that her chopsticks had frozen. While he was staring at her anxiously, she chewed the noodles and took a bite, but she didn't really taste them. She joked, "I hope you aren't suggesting I go missing," but even she couldn't hear herself. "No, but I could give you 2-month-long C-rank mission in Tea Country. No hostilities expected. You could think of it as a paid holiday," he said. The mission was taken by Tsubaki. She was tired of thinking back on their training sessions with Mizuki, their evenings spent together, their tender words and kisses, and the inconspicuous, cruel things that occasionally escaped his lips but seemed so clear in retrospect. She was sick of viewing her friends suspiciously and questioned whether Mizuki was the only one who harbored feelings of betrayal. 2 months of fresh air were exactly what she needed to close the chapter of her life that was named Mizuki. The interior of the safe house that Naruto had taken up residence in was far better maintained than the exterior had given him the impression. With a hallway that ran the length of the house, a tiny kitchen with a stove and a tiny oven, a bathroom, an all-purpose space that served as a living area, a bedroom, and a dining room that was covered by tatami and only minimally furnished, it had been constructed traditionally. A bookcase, a chest, a few pillows for sitting, and a small table that was easy to carry to the side were all there was. From the chest, he discovered bed linens that smelled musty. His steps left distinct footprints on the mats, and everything was covered in dust. The next task was to find dinner after Naruto successfully navigated the clever traps, some of which he was going to learn how to set up again. He proceeded to the kitchen and began searching the cabinets. The house was devoid of any ramen packets. While he read the labels and selected cans at random from the shelves, he complained, "What sort of a sucky safe house is this?" There were canned peaches in syrup, cartons of applesauce with seals painted on top to prevent the sauce from spoiling, and cans of green beans, leeks, and sliced water chestnuts. He discovered a carton labeled Mama's Better powdered milk at the far end of the lowest cupboard, along with canned tuna and chicken and multiple jars filled with spices. Naruto believed that this food supply would endure a minor apocalypse. No ramen, though. Unlooking forward to the shopping trip, he muttered, note to self, "Go shopping tomorrow," as he prepared ninja hash with a can of tuna and a can of beans. Customers would glare at him because the shopkeepers always charged him more than others. After he had brought Bachan back to the village, things had actually improved, but that only meant he was unsure of when he would be ignored. However, nobody here knew anything about him. They would only be aware of what he decided to tell them. Satisfied with this realization, Naruto prepared and consumed his dinner. Following this, he had nothing much to do with his day other than get his futon ready, and a new issue arose: boredom. Boredom and Naruto. Halfway through the tea country prefecture of Iruka, back in Konoha, Kakashi and Jiraiya experienced an unexplained chill. Naruto looked everywhere in the house for something to do. A deck of cards was all that was present, and Naruto had never won a solitaire game. The only person he had ever lost to in cards was himself. He then turned to the bookcase and examined its contents. Naruto had lost all the naughty fun he had initially gotten out of doing something perverted when Jiraiya had made him a proofreader, and he simply didn't understand what was so great about telling the same plot 100 times under different names. There were 2 Icha Ikas, one with a man and woman on the cover and the other with 2 women. There were several ninja manuals, a couple romance novels, and a book about poetry that made Naruto's eyes water when he tried to read it. The last one appeared promising, but there were also some about weapon maintenance, something about art of war that also made Naruto's eyes water, and one about creating basic seals, storage seals, and the like. How to make your own explosives, a Kayakujutsu training manual, from cleaning supplies to warfare. Naruto became engrossed. After 10 minutes, the book's straightforward instructions opened up a whole new world for him, as he had previously only learned that explosions were caused by exploding tags. After 10 more minutes, he was searching the cupboards once more for the aforementioned supplies. He needed to buy some more items because the kitchen had hot plates and a bottle of bleach in the bathroom, but there were no enameled steel containers. Ammonia and iodine crystals were required for the second recipe. Ammoniac was available for toilet cleaning, but Naruto was unaware of what iodine crystals were. He hoped they weren't too costly. He was unsure of where to find the rust and other powders needed to make touch explosives. He looked at the available pots and pans and said, "Why don't they teach this at the academy? Doesn't seem too hard." Without asking anyone, he hadn't anticipated much, but it looked like this might end up being a teaching moment. When the sun came up, Naruto set out to find a job in some ramen. Matsuzaki Eriko was the merchant Jiraiya had sent Naruto to. After laughing at the girly name, the old man glared at Naruto and then burst out laughing when Naruto revealed his own name. He yelled, "You are living in a helluva big glass house, ramen topping," while gripping his insides despite his belief that this was something Iruka-sensei would have said he deserved. Naruto now glared at him. He objected, saying, "It's written with the kanji for maelstrom." Finally controlling his snickering, the elderly man leaned against his office desk. "Yeah, and mine's a herbal remedy," he replied. He enjoyed slapping Naruto over the head with his cane and wore a dumb yukata with a sunflower pattern. They got along well after Naruto categorized him under the mental category of crazy old man. Naruto had learned early in life that having a buffer never hurt, so it was fortunate that the job was paying even though Jiraiya had left him enough money for travel for the 2 months. Since the man sold a variety of imported treats like coffee, chocolate, raisins and nuts, fresh fruits, cookies, and cheese, all of which were obviously transported to him by ships. It was fortunate that their store was close to the harbor. The crates needed to be moved to the shop's storage rooms after being moved to a warehouse Matsuzaki had rented for a shipment a few days prior. He fanned himself with his account book and said, "I can't afford to keep men on payroll so they can sit on their fat asses, so I hire them for this every time. How many you need?" It was a hot day, and he vowed that it would only get hotter. "Hey, none, just look at this." Kage Bunshin. As the number of Narutos at Matsuzaki's Better Delicacies shop increased from 1 to 10, there were tiny puffs of smoke and ebbing, chattering sounds. Matsuzaki's voice could have defeated Suna's for dryness. "And here I thought you were supposed to not let people know you are a shinobi," he said. Naruto grinned sheepishly and scratched his head. He applied henge and said, "I can get around that too," so that there was just Naruto and 9 of his fellow genin. He had to use Neji, Lee, and this guy Genai from the Chunin exams, who didn't finish the first phase, so the rest of his team was disqualified, to bolster the ranks because girls didn't really do the heavy lifting in the Civi world. Not everyone could win every time, but he felt a little bad for making the clone look like that chicken. Thus, Naruto and his clones began their work, climbing, scuttling, and carrying crates between the shop and the warehouse. Kabuto attempted to frighten Naruto by flirting with Nahitu, but it turned out that this strategy wasn't very effective after all. They shared a similar sense of humor. Everything proceeded smoothly until Naruto had to carry the final crate of nuts by himself. A man with an untidy beard walked by Naruto about 50 feet into the street, slamming into him with his shoulder and nearly knocking him down in the ditch. The man complained upon contact, looking down at Naruto from a remarkable height. "Watch where you're going, punk," he said when he moved his arms. His biceps appeared to be attempting to mate beneath his skin. Naruto yelled back at the man, "You're the one who pushed me, jerk," and then everything happened very quickly. Even a recent academy graduate could have cleaned this man's clock before he moved to hit Naruto, who may only be a genin, while the man was lying in the ditch, groaning. Naruto marched on without even bothering to do anything fancy, just jabbing him hard in the stomach with the corner of the crate if anyone was staring at him while he was humming joyfully. He was too accustomed to it to even recall that they weren't allowed to do that in this place. Furthermore, he had never bothered to find out what those tattoos and a missing middle finger meant because he was from a village with absolutely no organized crime. Naruto was given responsibility for the shop exactly 4 hours into his job. Matsuzaki was standing on an old, rickety ladder, putting new jars of fruit marmalade on the top shelf, when an elderly woman wearing a fancy, embroidered kimono entered. The woman was carrying 2 small, dirty white furred dogs. The color was dirty white, meaning that Naruto felt sorry for the dogs and believed they should never be allowed to get dirty because making them constantly clean and tidy went against their natural dog instincts. The dogs ran toward him as he crouched to place some crackers on the lowest shelf, which was a little behind the ladder. Additionally, the elderly woman's hand was ripped of the dog leashes, which had been tied together to make it easy to hold them with one hand. From one side of the ladder, one dog went, and from the other Naruto, already congratulating himself on the quick save, leapt to catch Matsuzaki. As the ladder fell, Matsuzaki's entire body jerked as he clutched his chest. Naruto was by no means a medical professional naturally. He was able to bandage wounds, set broken bones as long as they were clean, and even perform stitches as long as the person receiving the stitches didn't mind them being a little unsightly and uneven. However, his lack of chakra control had made learning medical jutsu impossible, and he had never shown any interest in it, even though he had once been friends with Kabuto, that rat bastard. Carrying Matsuzaki on his shoulder, he did the first thing that came to mind and ran to the hospital. Although Matsuzaki's life was spared, which was fortunate, and the elderly woman even covered the hospital expenses because she was at fault, the issue of what to do with the store remained. Matsuzaki was told by a nurse wearing a white yukata and an angular, stern face, "You need to rest. Eriko Baka, you aren't as young as you used to be and you could stand to lose some weight as well. It was only because of how quickly your employee got you here that you survived at all." From his lying position, the elderly man glared at him. He began to say, "Look, you evil, old hag," but the nurse quickly struck him over the head with her papers. As she yelled, Naruto ignored her. "Who are you calling old, you mummy? I'll have you knowing, I'll still be a spring chicken when you rest in your grave." The whole situation made him miss Sakura-chan a lot, and it was clear that they were old friends now that he would have an address for her to write back to. Perhaps he ought to write her. What a fantastic idea. After some time, he saw that Matsuzaki and the nurse both turned to gaze at him inquisitively. Matsuzaki asked him, "Can you take care of the shop, but I could go to my niece?" Naruto smiled wryly at him. "I worked for a lot of shops back home," said the man. He didn't mention D ranks because he wasn't sure Sakuya, the nurse, was reliable, but Matsuzaki ought to be aware of it anyhow, and he appeared comforted. Sakuya ruffled Matsuzaki's hair and said, "You can leave your stupid employer to me, I'm his niece's neighbor, I'll see to it that he gets plenty of rest." Despite making a deep, offended noise in his throat, Matsuzaki appeared somewhat content. Naruto declared, "I'll do a very good job, I promise." Although he had never been in charge of an entire store by himself, he had experience working behind the counter and was capable of handling accounting because, after all, he had handled his own money since he was 10. He could then use the traps and seals that had been in the safe house before he entered. In addition to carrying things and guarding the area from robbers and other threats, there were no criminals under his supervision. Naruto meticulously drew the seal and set the traps that evening. He wasn't really sure why they operated the way they did, but as long as you weren't attempting to make a new seal, it didn't matter. All that mattered was being able to replicate what you had already been shown exactly, and the word perfectly couldn't be overstated. When he arrived at the shop early the following day to do some sweeping, he discovered 5 thugs unconscious by the small window next to the back door. He just heaved them off to a strip of weed-infested wasteland between 2 streets and was done with it. Without even bothering to take them to the police after that, he opened the store for business. He also discovered that it wasn't the end of it. It started right before Naruto shut down the store for lunch. He was simply waiting for the 2 housewives and their kids, a cute little girl with pigtails and a boy Naruto was certain was carrying a frog in his pocket, to depart, even though the store had this adorable little sign featuring a panda with a speech bubble. Then 2 males entered. He sighed when he realized that one of them was the powerful man from the previous day. Why did people always have to be such terrible losers? As if they were Sasuke Tem. Naruto pondered whether they were brothers because they looked so alike. Even though the other was a little heavier and shorter than the first, they even wore similar outfits and had similar tattoos. However, it was kind of a hilarious coincidence that they were both missing the middle finger. "Now you are gonna get it, punk," snarled the yesterday's idiot. He was crackling his knuckles, but Naruto smirked because the attempt only looked amusing due to the missing finger. But when the little girl started crying and the women pressed themselves flat against the wall, his smile vanished, mistaking his response for fear. The second idiot snorted. He scoffed at the women and began, "And a woman too," but he never finished because if there was anything Naruto detested more than the evil maniacs themselves, the evil maniacs backstabbing medic nins, and the thoughtless bastards who fled to play sensei and student with the evil maniacs who invaded Konoha, it was those who tormented defenseless civilian women and children. The 2 men were easily defeated. They only needed to be punched once each. After that, the scene was peculiar. The little girl stopped crying as the women in their pricey, pink kimonos watched him with eyes as big and round as plates. Naruto made a peace sign and smiled at them. Naruto felt his heart swell with a warm, humorous, foolishly joyful feeling as the young boy gazed at him with hero worship in his eyes. The boy offered, "I have a frog," and came forward with the tiny amphibian in his pocket. Naruto's mother gave him a startled look and stumbled an apology before grabbing his arm and pulling him back. Naruto nodded and avoided looking at the woman by focusing on the boy. "Frogs are awesome," he said, even though it shouldn't have hurt so much. The boy's smile helped a little to make the boy feel better. Naruto gave him a candied apple after the young girl smiled and giggled a little. The women hurried off after making their purchases, but it wasn't over yet. When it was time to shut down the store for the evening, Naruto took a shortcut through a tiny, dim alley and was confronted by yet another thug. Naruto was certain now that it was a big, heavy man with a missing tooth and that missing finger, as Kakashi-sensei used to say. Once was chance, twice was circumstance, but 3 times was already a pattern. When 3 women in skimpy attire happened to pass the alley, one of them happened to glance there, but the third man didn't object any more than the first 2 had. She yelled in alarm. They all come to a complete halt. They looked down at the man on the ground and up at Naruto, who was completely unhurt and rubbing his head sheepishly. "This isn't what it looks like," he said, trying to appear innocuous. They screamed and fled in the opposite direction for their lives. As was to be expected, Naruto slumped. He complained, "What a lousy day this has been." As Tsubaki made her way through the streets to the safe house Jiraiya-sama had directed her to, she concluded that Makima was a pleasant little town. The squeaking and rumbling of the few merchant charts that were rolled to their designated plots for the day were muffled by the chirping of birds in the early morning. She considered getting herself a swimsuit as she gazed out at the sea, which glistened in the early morning light. The idea was becoming more and more refined every minute. As Iruka had stated, a paid holiday. Her sole responsibility was to make sure Uzumaki Naruto didn't do anything foolish or ostentatious that would draw the attention of shinobi aside from the boy's boisterous behavior. This was a nation devoid of any true political significance, or secret village spies were put in this type of location as a form of discipline when they ruined something significant. What might go wrong? When Ono Tsubaki discovered her charge was engaged in a small-scale conflict with the local Yakuza, She regretted asking herself this question. She demanded answers from the brat sitting in the center of the safe house's floor, bandaging a young woman's leg. "What do you think you are doing, Uzumaki? You were supposed to keep low profile. Do I need to explain you what that means? And who is she?" She asked with her round face, brown hair, and dark, attractive eyes. She was attractive enough in a way that didn't intimidate anyone. Now was not the time to start showing interest in the other gender. In fact, she was starting to question how he had made it this far in life, much less become a genin. Naruto opened his explanation by saying, "She's Miwa-chan." Those thugs were beating her up, but the girl put a hand on his arm and met Tsubaki's gaze. It was unexpected that the mousy girl's demeanor suddenly became fierce. "They were going to rape me." The girl silently stated her name was Miwa. Her voice was barely audible, but the intensity and grim satisfaction of her statement were evident. "I'm a prostitute. I work for the Yakuza. They take most of the money I earn and they take me whenever they feel like it." Naruto-kun killed those men. Tsubaki was shocked to learn that it had been the boy's first kill as Naruto gazed at his hands as if he had never seen them before. However, Naruto's eyes hardened as the shadows were driven away. "No one who does that to other people deserves to live. Don't worry, Miwa-chan. You won't ever be going back to those people," he promised. Tsubaki had a lot of thoughts racing through his mind. "You will see that many people do so and live to do it again." The talk was even included in the academy curriculum. Ninja sex education covered the standard contraception, diseases and health risks associated with underage pregnancy, as well as rape as interrogation tactics and prostitution as part of infiltration tactics. The wistful that girl loves him and he has no idea. Pushed aside the incredulous that he was fighting Yakuza without killing them. What did he do? And arrest them? They were living in such a world. Naruto slammed his fist into the air and yelled, "Well, I'm gonna change that because I'm not gonna change, believe it." Because no one could change some things, it made Tsubaki sad. Sad for someone besides herself. However, Naruto was the type of person who would allow him to save Miwa if Tsubaki allowed it. Demon Brat clenched his teeth as he recalled the man who had lied to her and how Naruto had been the one to catch him. She recalled the nasty rumors that had always followed the boy. She had always said yes and enjoyed it, so it hadn't been rape, but she still felt violated. Additionally, she was suspected, held accountable, and viewed as filthy, much like many people view whores. Even in Konoha, some people would argue that raping a prostitute was not considered a crime. Nobody deserves to live who treats others that way. "I was Mizuki's lover. Did you know that?" she inquired. Naruto appeared somewhat stunned, but also nice. She wasn't positive that she was interpreting him correctly. He said, "That must have sucked. I bet he was a bad kisser too," which made Tsubaki laugh out loud. Despite her career choice and the fact that she wasn't naturally violent, she was a little taken aback to see that her knuckles were turning white. She opened her fists deliberately. "Those Yakuza are lucky, Naruto-kun," she thought as she gazed out the window, feeling inebriated and unsteady on her feet. She wasn't sure if Naruto-kun had simply fixed the fracture or had completely destroyed her after Mizuki had hit her, but she had forgotten what it felt like to feel this good. The sun had finally risen above the rooftops outside. "This will be a beautiful day to die." Seihara Hiro, the undisputed boss of Makimura's shady underworld, had spent years constructing his criminal enterprise. Within a week, it was destroyed, and he didn't appear to be upset with Tsubaki if she expressed her annoyance to Naruto after he dropped them off at the police station. She was too cunning to be apprehended in any case. Time is a complex concept that depends on how it is perceived. Weeks and days can sometimes pass by like hours and days, short, ephemeral moments. According to Naruto's experiences at the academy, minutes can occasionally seem to drag on forever. From an objective standpoint, 2 months isn't that long. Matsuzaki Eriko would testify that it took him almost no time at all to see that the silly, amiable front that child Jiraiya-sama had left behind was a complete fabrication. The prostitutes who initially timidly slipped in to meet the new management would say their Naruto-kun left too soon, while the chief of police would say those 2 months were the longest of his life and that he had never had so many gray hairs due to one person before. After all, they had once been prostitutes. Even 1,000 miles of travel start with a single step. When 2 missing nin from Kiri stepped off the deck of a merchant ship in search of work and a hiding place, Naruto's adventure officially began. Konatsu and Kaide didn't even have to look for the rumors because they were everywhere. It was whispered with excitement, concern, and amazement that it had been real ninja who had done it, that old man Seihara had been overthrown, and that all of his men were either dead or imprisoned. The whole criminal world was in complete chaos. They were eating their lunch slowly in a dango diner, but they were really more interested in what the few men seated next to them had to say. "I heard that Matsuzaki-san is involved somehow in this affair. Who would have thought? He was always so respectable," person one said with evident pleasure. He had a characteristic Adam's apple, red hair, and a mole in his left cheek. Person 2 had brown hair, brown eyes, and buck teeth. I hear the new boss is so young he doesn't even shave yet, that blonde kid, remember, Person 2 said. There are two of them, they are identical twins. I saw them in the docks yesterday, but I don't think they are really ninja. I mean, they didn't have those bandanas with the metal plate, whatever they were called again, said Person 3, also known as the good-looking one. Person 2 took a gulp from his sake jar and asked dryly, and what normal people run over rooftops? After exchanging glances, Konatsu and Kaide left the diner after finishing their meal. Trying not to show his fear, Kaide said, so, a missing nin organization has taken over. Do you think they recruit? No one in Kirigakure remained squeamish for very long, so he wasn't the most squeamish person there was. But some of the rumors about the kinds of missions missing nin got involved in, beginning with the murder of infants and getting worse from there, gave him the creeps. Konatsu's eyes, however, were bright. If they have only just taken over, there must be much work to do. I'm sure I can get us in, and then we'll have safety in numbers, she said with satisfaction. Both Kaide and Mizushima Konatsu had preconceived notions about how the world, and the ninja world specifically, operated. Knowing that only half of their classmates would live, those had been established through years and years of brutal training and icy, and, in Kaide's case, uneasy, eyeing. They had a strong belief that you could only trust your family, and frequently not all of them, after years of witnessing young children begging for food until they hardly noticed it, biannual death patrols to weed out all Kekkei Genkai users, and the discovery of good, selfless people like priests and volunteer workers at homeless shelters who had been robbed and occasionally killed. That certainty vanished when they entered Matsuzaki's Better Delicacies shop and saw the blonde, smiling boy behind the counter. It would be an understatement to say that Tsubaki was not overly thrilled when Naruto-kun brought two missing nin back to the safe house. In general, missing nin were scum, either those who sold their allegiance or those who couldn't keep their violence directed at respectable targets. About half of the people who fled Kirigakure were either political dissidents or victims of extreme abuses of power, but they were desperate and all too willing to do whatever it took to survive, including killing those who had thought of them as allies. This made Kirigakure a unique case. Before the average Kiri missing nin left their country's borders, their hearts were dead 7 times over. The person posing as Natsu said, so this isn't a missing nin operation? Even though Tsubaki was certain that wasn't her true name, she answered it with such ease that she assumed it was an old alias or nickname. Konoha has interest in tea country. Naruto-kun responded, showing exceptionally good judgment by not revealing his sensei's name to these individuals. I bet half of my graduating class couldn't tell tea country from the map. No, I was just dumped here until my sensei gets the important stuff done, he said, though he exaggerated a little. He wasn't lying either about Konoha's general lack of interest in tea country. To put it another way, tea country was stable, peaceful, and prosperous, not the kind of place that offered many opportunities for ninja. They studied the Big Five in great detail in history classes, and C ranks swiftly covered their smaller border neighbor. The boy, whose name was supposedly Katsu, was more obviously uncomfortable with it than the girl with hers. He trotted after the girl like a devoted puppy and said, "Ah, I fear we have been followed, or we will be in short time." Regarding the girl, she gave him a slight glare, but he defiantly lifted his chin, and the girl concealed a sigh. As a result, the girl reluctantly accepted his higher moral standards. You might find this information useful. Naruto-kun waved his hand and said, can't be worse than Gato or Zabuza or the Dodu Kazuhana creep that bothered Yukihime. Before he even made a chunin, Tsubaki paused to think about how Naruto-kun had helped bring down 2 oppressive regimes. However, before she could be fully perplexed, the girl named Natsu placed her teacup on the table with a loud clink. She said, so that's where I had heard your name before they named the Great Naruto Bridge after you. And the boy going by the name of Katsu gave him a grateful look after Natsu appeared to be thinking about something. Tsubaki suddenly understood. Even after meeting Naruto-kun, she hadn't anticipated that he would be able to protect them. Natsu had planned to use the 2 of them as a distraction against anyone who might have followed her and her brother and fled while the dust was still settling. She could tell he was inexperienced, and she likely thought Tsubaki was just a chunin because she followed Naruto-kun's lead and protested notwithstanding, not really trying to make her objections stick. Although it wasn't a bad plan, Tsubaki was incensed. It wasn't until both Natsu and Katsu turned to face her with their hands at their weapons that she realized she was letting out a significant amount of murderous intent, that someone would use Naruto-kun in that way. Tsubaki inhaled deeply, forcing the red in his eyes to go away. She told Naruto-kun, everything is fine, and forced a smile. The fact that she was taking her cues from genins like Uzumaki Naruto would have saddened many, but Tsubaki had already made up her mind when she first bared her blade. And she wasn't the kind to change it at the drop of a hat. She would wait to see where they would go with this special Naruto-kun Nindo. Furthermore, it would be simpler for her to murder these two if they believed she was Chunin instead of Junin. Tsubaki had vowed never to be anyone's fool again, but she was prepared to give this alliance a chance. Miwa had once studied under a geisha. She worked her way up from a servant girl to a student and even an apprentice geisha, Maiko, after her father sold her to a geisha house when she was 5 years old. The fact that her geisha house had been located in an illegal geisha district was just bad luck for her. The most popular districts were the unlicensed ones. They were so popular that a man could frequently not find enough space to sit on the floor of a tea house. There was less standing in ceremony and more fun. However, even though a girl could make a good living there, she also had to live in constant fear that the authorities might decide to close the unlicensed district, in which case she would have to find another geisha. This was their luck. Miwa was unable to do it. She probably could have found a home if she had already been a full-fledged geisha, but since no one needed an extra Maiko, she was forced to become a prostitute and make clouds and rain with any man who would pay for her. She was thrown out with her best friends Yuriko and Aiko, so she wasn't the only girl in this situation. She didn't think she would live long because life was hard. If she didn't starve after being cheated on or someone didn't kill her, she would undoubtedly succumb to some illness soon. Everything changed when Naruto arrived after killing the men who attempted to rape her. He took her to his home and took care of her. She discovered that she was no longer a whore when he and the older woman, Tsubaki, seized Makima from the dreadful man who had claimed the city as his territory. After giving the house a critical inspection, Naruto-kun remarked, "We could turn it into an inn and a bar." When he asked, "You can sing and play something, right? Since you used to be a geisha?" Miwa was unable to remind him that she wasn't quite a geisha yet. Naruto-kun didn't seem to care. He just thought she was cool. She blushed, hoping she wasn't getting ahead of herself. Aiko and Yuriko were as well. "They can sing and dance there. I would like to help you personally, if you don't mind," she said. She really wanted to be in his life. A ninja was Naruto-kun. The idea alone sent shivers down Miwa's spine. As you filled their glasses, important men would whisper to each other about the shinobi, which were the stories she had heard as a child. There have been rumors of kidnappings and murders, men with such awful jutsu that they could kill entire armies, and gorgeous, alluring women who could extract every secret from a man and then abandon him. Ninjas had always frightened Miwa. She even had a slight fear of Tsubaki-san. She never would have imagined asking to work as a shadow killer's secretary, assistant, or anything else. However, Naruto-kun was cheerful and kind even though he wasn't dressed like a shinobi. His vivid orange and blue outfit stood out against it. Orange was her new favorite color, and Naruto-kun was her new hero. Recently, Makima had become a battlefield for the right. In addition to a woman no one had seen up close, a kunoichi, and possibly his lover as well, there was a boy who was rumored to be a shinobi of some kind. The chief of police felt something like sympathy for the boy because of the rumor. It's not an excuse, though I insult those who suffer the same but choose not to commit crimes if I pardon someone who commits horrible acts because he is being used. Infuriatingly, there was no evidence at all that these individuals had killed anyone, despite the presence of a boy, a woman, a criminal empire in ruins, Yakuza in custody, Yakuza missing, and multiple Yakuza corpses. It was a lovely day. The chief of police hadn't seen his wife in 3 days, and the violence appeared to have stopped. Whether it was a locust plague or a ninja invasion, he had today off. Sakumo grunted, "Good." As he looked down at the letter he had been reading. He was seated on a bench beneath the shade of cherry trees in a park close to a Shinto temple. Reiko looked up from the young princess she was holding and said, "Good what?" They had nearly given up hope after Reiko struggled to conceive for a long time, but Ruka was 3 months old and the love of their lives. The best, and priciest, restaurant in Makima was Seashore Palace. "My cousin Ichiro has finally decided to propose to Hamasaki Kiku. He plans to ask her to marry him next week at the Mermaid Festival at the Seashore Palace." It was beyond Takumo's comprehension how Ichiro had secured a reservation for that day. Reiko gave him a smile. "Then shall we gather chrysanthemums, dearest, for their table at the festival?" To help Ichiro gather his chrysanthemum, she joked. It was a lovely day, serene and golden with sunshine. It must have ended. Of course. Takumo turned his head to look when he heard a girl crying. He noticed a girl standing beneath the red torii gate, wearing a yellow yukata, looking up and crying, evidently scared to descend. A cat had scaled to the gate's lower lintel and meowed there. Takumo felt his heart stop when he saw the girl pulling a young boy's orange sleeve. The boy's hair was a vivid yellow color. Black was the most common hair color in tea countries. Some people's hair was light brown or dark brown, but yellow was unusual and exotic blondes were uncommon, even in a tourist city like Makima. Although he was unable to see the face, the girl tugged once more, and Takumo got to his feet in alarm, hoping Sato would have the common sense too. Instead of walking at a 90-degree angle to the ground, the boy who goes by Sato Naruto walked up the gate's beam as if it were flat ground, as if it were nothing. He snatched the cat and threw it to the girl, jumping down with a somersault that would have left Takumo with a broken neck or a twisted ankle. Sato ruffled her hair and grinned sweetly as she yelled with joy and pressed the unkempt black object to her chest. Takumo's internal organs twisted. He had once heard his shisho say, "The ones who make a show of being affable are always the worst. It takes a certain kind of man to murder in cold blood, but the kind that murder in cold blood and then hold charity auction, make nice with cute kids and save kittens is worse. They have something loose in here." He was twirling his finger along his temple. Takumo was unable to recall a single instance in which his shisho had been incorrect. Morino Idate's first instinct was to strike his head against something solid after learning that Makima had been overrun by 2 missing nins. Even at its best, Idate disliked the ninja world. The green-eyed monster known as Envy once tore at his heart, but Naruto helped him recover some of his lost dignity by winning the yearly race and receiving some encouraging words from his brother. Had handed the remainder to him when he didn't have to put himself through tests designed to make most attendants fail and be used by someone who would use him to do their dirty job and then throw him away like trash. Life was simply that much better, even when viewed objectively. All right, maybe he was still a little bit bitter. Idate had been waiting impatiently for Ibiki to take Team 7 back to Konoha, but he had given himself permission to unwind when, even after months, no one showed up to insist that he return to Konoha. Although some people believe that there are better opportunities elsewhere, Idate had experienced both sides of the debate and preferred his civilian life. At the very least, Ibiki ought to have changed his status from Kia to Mia. Idate would always be thankful that he hadn't, but it appeared that trouble had finally made its way to the tranquil tea country. After giving it some serious thought, he went to Wasabi Jirocho, the man who had taken him in from the ditch and raised him like a son. Jirocho Wasabi was a large man. His gentle yet somewhat rugged features seemed to declare that, like a mountain, he was immovable and here to stay. He was drinking tea from a delicate china cup that nearly vanished into his large hands while he sat behind his desk. He wasn't a man to be deceived by ostentatious gilding or cheap glittering. His austere room, free of any superfluous clutter, and his simple gray kimono were like his own reflections as usual. He felt like a slightly better person than he actually was when he smiled at Idate when he entered. When Jirocho nodded, he went on, "With your permission I would go there and see how much truth there is to them." "Father, I'm sure you have heard the rumors from Makima as well?" he asked. Jirocho said, "Why bother? Makima is far from here." But Idate sensed that he was merely inquisitive rather than necessarily disapproving. Tea Country was a tranquil region of lush rice fields and fertile orchards, harbor cities that bustled with life, and smaller, picturesque country towns. "I know how these things progress. If Makima becomes a center of missing nin action, it will invite hunter nins, and hunter nins in turn will invite spies. Before we know it, this isn't just a problem of one town. It will spread slowly but surely over the entire country." Of course it wasn't ideal, but where was it? Some missing nin had another thing coming if they believed they could bring Tea Country down to their level. Jirocho didn't appear pleased, but he hadn't refused either. "But what could you do? You left that life behind a long time ago and I know you have only practiced running. Maybe they would get Naruto's team again if they were lucky. I'll just make sure that it's true and not just another tall tale about Yakuza turf war. If it's true, then I'll make a risk assessment and we will know how much help we need to request from Konoha." Despite his tendency to talk a lot, Naruto had a good heart. Idate was actually a little concerned about him in a hidden village. A pure heart was begging for trouble. Jirocho, looking at Idate over the rim of his cup, said softly, "You would call for Konoha?" It had been a long time since they had discussed Ibiki's life and how it affected Idate's perception of the shinobi world. It had been a long time coming. In all honesty, Idate replied, "I'm not happy to deal with them," though he didn't say it aloud. He did say, "But now the situation is still salvageable. Better a team from Konoha now that the countryside overrun by foreign agent the next year. All I want is to keep our house safe." Jirocho gave him a smile and clinked his teacup down. Idate put on his weights and packed his rucksack. He was somewhat inexperienced in the field of shinobi, but he was just as good at reconnaissance as anyone else. He had learned from Naruto that fighting for what was rightfully yours was a ninja tactic that even Idate could support. When the first man entered, Naruto was busy reorganizing the Yakuza business. Tsubaki-chan had given him a moniker for the insane missing finger individuals, so the girls could make an honest living while Naruto sat on a stool by the chocolate aisle and reviewed the books Konatsu-chan had stolen for him. Miwa-chan, who had been promoted to his personal assistant, was performing the actual work behind the counter. Naruto excelled in mathematics. This was not due to any innate talent, but rather to a number of petty, obstructive Konohan bureaucrats who forced him to be frugal as a child. A man could easily become wealthy with the casino boat, the money he would take from Seihara's safe house, and the bordellos he would convert into inns. However, his objective was to hire all the girls, and at the moment, there were still 24 of them that he couldn't find a place to stay. Miwa-chan, however, had faith in him. He couldn't disappoint her. As he approached Naruto slowly, the man he had initially mistaken for a customer said, "Excuse me, Sato-sama." He was a plump, middle-aged man who wore very nice clothes. A brown envelope was in his hand. "I am," Naruto cheerfully acknowledged. He wasn't referred to as Sama very often or at all because Sato was the most popular last name in T-Country and because Jiraiya didn't think Naruto would remember to use a fictitious first name when introducing himself. He chose Sato Naruto as his name. Really, he would have remembered. However, he didn't want to lose Naruto's awesome name. Even for a brief moment he was telling that story, and he was telling it. "I came to, greet and congratulate you for your, quick promotion to your current position, and also, I think we can reach an arrangement? So that everything will go smoothly?" The individual struggled to speak. He didn't seem very confident in himself. Naruto closed his account books and asked, "Who are you and what sort of arrangement are you speaking about?" Perhaps the man wanted to place a large order because he was a customer of Matsuzaki's? He had no idea what other promotion the man might be talking about. The man thrust the envelope into Naruto's hands and backed away a few steps while staring expectantly at him. "I am Suzuki Eiji, the owner of the Billow and Wind, a restaurant by the promenade. I trust that if I, pay for protection I'll have no need to worry over, unfortunate fire-related accidents." The way he looked at him, both hopeful and anxious, may have been the reason Naruto asked, but this is when he had a revelation. Like all ninja villages, Konoha had a highly efficient fire department. When many of the villagers were involved in the trade of fire jutsu and various types of explosions, it was essential. In the brief time he had spent traveling with Jiraiya-sensei, he had already discovered that this was not the case in the civilian settlements. In small towns and villages, firefighting was handled by the local police force. In large cities, one of the samurai families was assigned to handle the duty, and their methods differed from one location to another. However, all of these makeshift fire departments had one thing in common. They lacked water jutsu and had poor mobility and reach because they had to transport large water tanks by carriage or make bucket chains from the closest well. Makima was certainly no different. He could locate a fire department, he could use the money and a portion of the Yakuza treasure to create a fund for the girls' wages, and this man was willing to pay him for it. He was fairly sure he could make it tax deductible, but he would need to check the local laws. Water jutsu would be useful for self-defense, and Konatsu-chan and Kaide could take on the roles of overseer and trainer. He told himself, this was a great idea. Suzuki, the pallid man, gave a nod and retreated from the store. Throughout the day, 17 concerned citizens contributed to the fire brigade fund, and Naruto and Miwa-chan had a lot of fun creating the awesome uniform. It was blue because, of course, firefighters wore tight, blue clothing to avoid getting caught anywhere and to protect their skin. Miwa-chan tapped her chin with the pencil and asked, "Do you think midnight blue or navy blue would look best? Or maybe dark blue or even ultramarine?" With a head rub, Naruto questioned, "There is a difference?" It had to be one of those things that girls do. After the required shopkeeping and the highly favored fire brigade planning, Naruto experimented with explosives at the conclusion of his 10th day in Makima. As usual, Miwa-chan was his devoted helper, and Tsubaki-chan was watching over him to make sure he didn't unintentionally blow up the safe house. What's his go-to source for everything that flashes and bangs at night? The absolutely fantastic Kayakujutsu training manual, from cleaning supplies to warfare. How to prepare your own explosives. Since explosive seals had become so common, Kayakujutsu, or the art of gunpowder, had become somewhat outdated, and many people mocked it as being cute. However, Naruto had survived his entire life on what little he could learn from his sensei. Iruka-sensei had been fair at the academy, at least, but Naruto had been just one of his students and admittedly a bit more maintenance than the poor teacher's time had allowed. Furthermore, many locations would seize any seals they discovered on a person, but why would anyone seize hot plates and bleach? He rummaged through the cold cabinet and suggested, "Let's start easy with the eggshell smoke bombs." Although the safe house lacked a refrigerator, it did have a cold cabinet with ice stored in the center of an array of insulating seals. It kept the perishable food fresh and would take about a week for the ice to melt enough to require additional purchases. Naruto then selected a dozen eggs. As she perused the book, Miwa-chan remarked, "Let's see, we need sugar, fertilizer with saltpeter, and a few other ingredients for this one. Also, cotton wool, aluminum foil and a pan. We'll be ready in no time at all." Konatsu-chan asked, "Why you bother to make bombs this day and age?" Naruto wasn't sure if she sounded inquisitive or skeptical. Tsubaki-chan had insisted that Konatsu and Kaide stay under her watchful eye, and Naruto didn't see why not. The majority of his nearly all-female company, he and Kaide were the only exceptions thus far, plus Eriko, who didn't count because he was Naruto's boss, lived in the former whorehouse dorms. In addition, Tsubaki-chan was excellent, and she most likely had a valid reason. He cheered, and Konatsu-chan made a tiny, aha, sound deep in her throat, because many places check you for seals, but no one cares about eggs and fertilizer. I'm Konoha's #1 surprising ninja and proud of it, he said. They then went to work. It seems that simply pouring the saltpeter into the sugar as would have been a bad idea, so Tsubaki-chan insisted on being the one who distilled it out of the fertilizer after Miwa-chan caramelized the sugar. While Kaide made himself useful by making a tiny hole in the eggshells and carefully sucking them dry, Naruto combined that with the other ingredients and applied the resulting substance, a kind of thick paste, to the folio to dry. He had apparently learned to enjoy the taste and had done it frequently as a child. For some odd reason, a string for a fuse was then added, and cotton wool was used to seal the hole after the dry paste had been powdered and poured into the eggs using a thin straw. They had 12 harmless-looking eggs sitting in their cartoon, and the kitchen counter was eventually piled high with different pans, glass jars, spoons, and a Primus stove. Naruto made the decision, now we try this out. They were all watching him carry one egg outside, in varying states of interest, as he jumped back just before the delicate eggshell exploded and carefully lit the short fuse. Smoke was present considering how tiny the egg had been. There was actually a surprising amount of smoke. Miwa-chan must have been generous with the sugar because the book claimed that the more sugar, the more smoke. The egg bomb created a mushroom pillar of pale purple cloud that engulfed the darkening front yard. Konatsu-chan nodded gratefully as Miwa-chan coughed. Not bad. You can buy sugar and fertilizer everywhere. Although her voice sounded sly, as if it were slithering its way into his ear, the smile that gradually appeared reminded him of Sakura-chan in the best possible way when she was feeling evil. This would be even cooler if we used something bigger than an egg, like a hollowed pumpkin. But why is it purple? Asked Naruto. The smoke was supposed to be white, according to the book. Tsubaki-chan guessed, I suppose that's from some chemical residue from something in the fertilizer. As he exclaimed, and the next time we can do something that really explodes. Naruto leapt to his feet. Overall, the evening had been enjoyable. Later, Morino Idate believed that he ought to have made a guess as soon as he heard Naruto's name. Although he was given the name Sato by these people, how many parents would give their child a name like Naruto? Such a name merely pleaded to be spelled incorrectly in kanji. He cautiously overheard a man in the blue uniform of the local police talking to a man in rough spun brown clothing in a small harbor bar, but he failed to make the connection. Idate hadn't forgotten his lessons about fitting in, but it was a rough place for rough people. I saw him at distance once, a pretty short guy, but he beat those thugs up like it was nothing. I heard that cream-ass chocolate Chandler Matsuzaki's involved. Who would have thought? He was supposed to be so respectable, the unkempt man said with obvious joy. Idate pretended to unwind as he sat back a little, sipped from his mug, and sighed with its weathered tables, smoke-blackened walls from the train oil lanterns, and no windows. The bar was a rather gloomy spot. It seemed as though the color brown had made the decision to attack and rob the world of all happiness. It was the kind of place where everyone who was intoxicated was either depressed or furious. The policeman asked in a hopeful tone, did you see him kill any of those thugs? Idate caught a glimpse of the man shaking his head out of the corner of his eye. He grunted and drained his ale mug. Nope. I ran like hell. Saw one of them the next day, with a bruise the size of a soup bowl on his cheek, he said. After this brief conversation, Idate was directed to Matsuzaki's Better Delicacies shop, where he was embarrassed when the girl behind the counter, a cute girl with lovely brown hair and a kind face but stern eyes, answered a question he hadn't even asked. The words were delivered with such conviction and coldness that they practically dripped ice firm to the ground. Walk down the Candlemaker's Street and down the stairs that lead to an empty stretch of beach. You may meet Naruto-kun there right now. I advise you to not try anything stupid, though you wouldn't like the results. Leaving the girl and the shop that smelled sweetly of peppermint and cinnamon, he nodded and thanked her. He felt it was unfortunate that she was engaged in such dubious activities and, in spite of himself, he wondered what her name was. He followed the girl's advice and the salty sea wind to the yellowish-brown beach and the ancient red granite stairs. The fact that it was rather rocky likely prevented tourists from invading this area of seawater and sand just yet. He noticed a group of people standing on the topmost stair. Although their ages ranged from the tween to the later 20s, they were all quite young. 3 figures were surrounded by a large circle of women dressed in rather basic yukata. There were a boy with bright daffodil yellow hair wearing an eye-catching orange jumpsuit, a girl with dark hair, And a boy dressed in blue. There is only one person in the entire world who could be that. He screamed, Naruto, what the hell are you doing here? And bounded down the steps. He was able to pass through the crowd of people dressed in plain pale blue and dim green. And he was confronted by a smiling Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto gave him a dazzling smile, but the females were snooping on him with flint in their dark eyes. Hey, Idate. It's great to see you. What are you doing here? We're training my fire brigade. Many were spreading their fingers like claws or clenching their hands into fists. One of them inquired, what is it that you want with Naruto-kun? Idate had the feeling that the entire group would try to tear out his eyes and, most likely, his heart if he responded incorrectly. After calming them down a little, he explained that these people would be a fire department, that the Yakuza had been eradicated from this area, and that Jiraiya the Sannin, had abandoned Naruto here for the entire 2 months. Only Naruto could have such a thing, but 2 months was more than he could handle given that Naruto was terminally incapable of hurting a caterpillar unless it first killed one of his friends. Idate had no idea where people had come to believe that he was a Yakuza leader. However, this circus would be leaving the town and the country in just 2 months. It wasn't harmful. He asked the entire group, we met a little while ago when he helped me, can I do something for you? And it was none of anyone's business but his own if he was thinking about the feisty girl in the store with the chocolate hair. By the end of the second week, Naruto had concluded that he was enjoying himself far more than he would have with Ero-sensei anyhow. Over the past 2 days, Idate had taught the girls how to defend themselves, and Konatsu-chan and Kaide had taught them a basic water jutsu called Sweeten. Mizurapa, it was somewhat similar to Sasuke Tomi's fireball jutsu, but instead it made you spit water. The girls were novices, but Naruto was the only one who had learned it thus far. He had no doubt that they would eventually obtain it. He decided to go meet Eriko and perhaps bring him the apple dumpling that Tsubaki-chan was preparing using the carved-out apple flesh while he was munching on one of the apples that were left over from that day's experiments. While seated in a folding chair outside the house, Kaide and Konatsu-chan were practicing hand-to-hand while shouting at one another and jumping high all over the yard. The sun was warm, and the apple was tart. Something had to happen, of course. Before he saw what Konatsu-chan and Kaide dodged, he witnessed them do so. The two young ninja had just been standing when 10 jagged icicles as long as Naruto's arm struck the ground, sinking deeply into the earth. A tall man wearing a blue kimono, a blue swirl mask, and a striped undershirt fell to the ground at their wake. Despite his relaxed shoulders and loose posture, which reminded Naruto of Kakashi-sensei, he exuded a sense of danger that persisted in Naruto's mind. However, the image of the man briefly overlapped with a smaller, slimmer figure standing on a tree branch as Konatsu drew her blade and Kaide called for Tsubaki Haku dressed as a hunter nin, but both he and Zabuza were dead. As he positioned his hands to make hand signals while waiting for his opponent to make the first move, the unidentified shinobi said in a flat, bored voice, "You kids got further than I thought possible, but now it's time for you to die." Naruto realized that he was making fun of Konatsu-chan by telling her that she had no chance and that she could now lie down and die. And if there was one thing you could be sure Naruto would always, unquestionably, and completely despise. His fingers moved with practiced ease, and before the man could say anything, if he had any intention of speaking at all, 50 shadow clones flooded the yard. "No, you won't. Your village is a hellhole. They're better off here and you aren't touching them. And who are you to tell other people they suck when you are such a happy evil minion anyway?" Together, they leapt against the man. After that, the chaos was tightly contained. Short bursts of impact and pain, followed by a sliver of black, passed through Naruto's mind as the man used water bullets to knock down 7 clones, but he didn't let it stop him. He was punched through, and after the man kicked him and blocked 3 clones, they were once more separated in a sizable pool of orange and yellow water, if not the sea. Using the same jutsu she had attempted to teach the girls that day, Konatsu-chan seized the opportunity to strike the man, but it struck the large oak behind where the hunter nin had just been standing for a brief moment. They all scurried around one another, examining one another at this point. 3 apples were flying straight at the man. He nodded mockingly to Tsubaki-chan and took a mocking step to the side. "The first thing you happen to hold, I presume?" he inquired. Naruto was also upset, but not to the point where he failed to notice Tsubaki-chan's raised eyebrows. It was impressive. Every window in the house was broken by an explosion. He had to pull a short blade in midair to meet Tsubaki-chan's after the ninja had dodged. The man landed on his feet after deftly avoiding 2 water jutsu that were aimed at him simultaneously. Naruto's foot slipped on the slick mud that had turned the ground beneath them. The hunter nin asked, "What was that?" and sounded a little shaken for the first time. "How you managed to fool me with genjutsu?" After shouting, "It wasn't genjutsu, it was a cute and quaint custom." Naruto threw himself forward and attempted to punch the man in the face, but the man reflexively blocked the blow. But now that his bombs had been proven correct, he couldn't be too sad about that. Konatsu-chan was right behind Kaide when he struck with his Kodachi, and a number of Naruto clones supported them. Naruto's vision flashed black, black as the clones perished. But fortunately, Kaide survived. Steel met steel. Witch clangs reverberated all the way down to Naruto's tooth roots as Tsubaki-chan engaged the enemy. However, he was also not sitting on his ass. He yelled the name of his method as he had completed flicking his fingers. Kachiyose no Jutsu. Naruto poured as much chakra into it as he could, and the great magenta toad, Gameiken, who was the same size as Gamabunta, appeared. The hunter Nin was directly above them. He nearly stepped aside. The always courteous Gameiken turned his head and seemed to be attempting to ascertain what and where the situation was. "You seem to have a situation here, Naruto. I hope I can be of some modest help," he said to his summoner. The scene was strange. The hunter Nin had been spared from becoming paste by a curved branch of the sturdy, old oak that had snapped under the great toad like a matchstick. Naruto was completely covered in mud, which had splashed everywhere. The clones of Naruto were all gone, and he was blinking the jet-colored darkness of death from his eyes. Fortunately, the tree had fallen not over the house or the geisha house next to it, but rather towards the road. The yard was barely large enough for the great toad warrior, and the rest of the muddy, wet fighters had pressed close to the house. The hunter Nin let out a moan of agony and loss. Tsubaki-chan pondered, "What are the neighbors thinking about us now, I wonder?" Her voice was the only dry object nearby. On top of him had fallen a gigantic toad shrike. Doihara Taiki was so tightly bound and stripped down to his underwear that he could hardly believe his own recollection. The boisterous, blonde boy in Kill Me Orange was reportedly Jiraiya. A Sanin student. Konoha harbored some romantic feelings for Mizushima Konatsu and her purported half-brother, or boyfriend. But he was unable to disclose this information to his superiors. She didn't experience the agony that such thoughts were meant to. For some reason he simply felt numb and bored, wondering if he would be sent to Konoha to be cared for by Morino Ibiki or tortured here for information. Taiki thought his question was answered when his captor's bright form trotted toward him. "Hey, I have a question for you, evil minion-san." The boy's smile was too big to be of any use, and his quarry's grim expression from across the room suggested that they would be delighted to help. His voice was harsh and clipped. "Codename Shrike, Junin, registration Idaho, 01554. He felt almost nude after his mask was removed, but he would never reveal his identity or anything more damning. According to Taiki's interpretation of the boy's body language, the boy blinked, and not really. Sato was more confused than anything. "That's nice, but about my question," Sato, lacking a better name, carried on with his initial line of reasoning. "Codename Shrike, Junin, registration Idaho, 01554. He repeated the information and inhaled deeply, bracing his body for a blow that would probably start with beatings and lack of sleep rather than anything seriously harmful. "Yeah, you told me that, but what I want," his daring interrogator was now starting to show signs of disappointment. Taiki considered that a minor triumph. "Codename Shrike, Junin." Red-faced and shouting over his rant, Sato asked, "Do you like apple dumplings?" Taiki tried to wrench his thoughts to the new rails, but his tongue froze in his mouth. "Apple dumplings? Where did the topic of apple dumplings come up? And why, dear Kami?" "They are good enough, I guess," was his casual response. Sato took one from a nearby table and shoved it into his mouth because it was sufficient. He found it difficult to swallow because it was sweet and hot. Sato went on to explain that Taiki could hear the capital letters when he first offered the dumplings to Gameiken, the Toad of Awesome, but that Gameiken had turned them down, so now there was enough for everyone. This was followed by silence, which he didn't break first. Taiki became uneasy and then angry as a result of Sato's conjecture. "Why are you Hunter Nin anyway? You don't look evil enough to like it in Kiri, is that it? You became hunter so you wouldn't have to spend time in Kiri." He had never considered his career choice in those terms, and he had no intention of doing so at this time. He assured himself, where did the word, like, come into play? "I am Kiri's property, no more and no less," with only his registration ID to distinguish him from 100 others. He was as white and frigid as his nation was in the winter, colorless and featureless as the snow blanketed the earth. He had a job to do, and he had done it flawlessly prior to this regrettable incident. Even his two genin teammates had been killed by him, and their red had blended with the winter white. It is impossible for a Kirigakure Academy graduate to be sentimental. What if he occasionally thought he had passed away and no one had noticed? Sato moaned, but the question wasn't really directed at anyone. "Not you two, just like Haku was. What it is with that place? You know what? You need some attitude adjustment. This is for your own best, so you insist on being property. Fine. Then I'm stealing you," said Sato after Taiki momentarily wondered who Haku was but chose not to ask. What? One word only. He was unable to even tag the end of it with a questioning note. The story started with a situation in Iowa involving a boy whose parents would really prefer not to be found or even suspected there. However, that was just the start of one tale before they part ways once more. The stories of various people overlap and share supporting characters, much like friends sharing a bento box, and one story has been going on for a long time while another is just getting started. A query. In a mirror, what color is a chameleon? Although Kabuto was unsure of the answer, he was beginning to believe that, like an old shirt that had been washed too frequently, he had completely lost his color. He was a devoted Konoha shinobi. Although the two were not mutually exclusive, he was also a devoted shinobi of the root, which was a whole other ball of clay. In reality, he was a faithful shinobi of Kumo, Suna, and Kiri, but things were getting so bad that every morning when he woke up, he had a moment when he forgot who he was supposed to be or to whom he was supposed to be loyal, or how it had initially felt to be loyal versus traitorous. Since all of his joints were in his head, it was unsettling to feel as though they were all loose and could dislocate at any time. There was something to do in one of Kiri's bars. An elderly shinobi gave Kabuto a sort of response. Kabuto had initially approached the man because he was intoxicated, which made it simpler to use the tiny bit of genjutsu that interfered with the transformation of short-term memories into long-term ones. After all, that man wouldn't want to question why he had asked that question in the first place. There was also the possibility that the man, who had been with Kiri's counterintelligence for years, might say something relevant. This man would not have existed in a different life, and Kabuto would have asked someone else and gotten a different response. However, the rough and tumble man sat there, depressed, inebriated, and alive, and he gave Kabuto a look that might have been considered pity. He sipped his sake and remarked, "Go play ninja with your genin team. Brat, you are too young to make that kind of career choice." Respectfully, Kabuto said, "Okay, so I'm too young to do that yet," and complied. "But what would I do if sometime I was deemed worthy?" he asked, his eyes with just the right amount of hero worship and not too much sense, and his body language open and eager to please. "Keep your body open. That sounds obscene." Momo had laughed. She was an orphan from the Red Lights district, but that was obviously long before they learned how to not find amusement in anything because amusement was distracting. The man was intoxicated, but there was a discrepancy between the broadcaster's naivete and the type of question he had posed. The man grunted and pushed him away, saying, "If you can't trust yourself to remember who you are, pick someone to remember it for you and do whatever they think you would do." Kabuto walked away. Considering his options, nobody en route would do it. How could they establish a suitable baseline for Kabuto when they could hardly recall who they were? Someone who hasn't yet damaged goods and is loyal to remind the roots why they were performing the grunt work. Someone from Konoha's uppermost leaves was needed, someone who would be approachable and receptive to his advances while embodying the concept of Konoha along with the necessary intelligence. He brought an idea back to Konoha on his own. He had discovered an S-class secret. He was aware of Uzumaki's father. Naruto made a new friend at the age of 5. The star-struck Naruto of that era believed that Kabuto, who went by Kabuto, knew everything. Naruto was sitting in a swing in the playground close to the orphanage when he first met the older boy, and it was well past dusk when he had sneaked out of the orphanage that day. He had heard some older children. They had argued that their curfew was the most unjust thing ever. They had been clan kids, dressed like their fathers in wire mesh, ninja pants, and dark shirts, but without weapons. One of them remarked, "If we could just sneak out after it's dark, that would be so cool." He carried a small puppy in his arms and had wild, mousy-colored hair. When Naruto once requested a puppy, the matron simply laughed at him. Can you imagine? No one would know? It was easy because it was the first story, so Naruto sneaked out through the window that night and went under the gate to reach the street. He didn't understand why the older boys found it so challenging because it was actually quite simple other than the fact that no one came to push him off the swing. He didn't understand what made playing after dark so enjoyable. However, when the gray-haired boy approached him for a conversation, he realized that nighttime was a fantastic time to meet new people. It was the first time he had ever had someone agree to his desire to play ninja. "We have to make drop bags first," Kabuto informed him. "What's a drop bag?" inquired Naruto. Despite feeling somewhat guilty for defying Hokage Jiji, he went with Kabuto down the street to the area of town that Hokage Jiji had warned him not to visit because he didn't want his new friend to think he was a baby. Drop bag is an emergency pack where you keep weapons, clothes and money, and you hide it in a secret location so that if something happens and you have to leave the village in a hurry, you don't have to leave empty-handed, Kabuto said. Although he played ninja in a different style than the others, it was still cool. Naruto and Kabuto played ninja together when they first met. They had to take notes on everyone who entered and left the warehouse where they were playing surveillance. There were only men carrying a lot of crates and no one particularly interesting. but Kabuto advised him to picture them as secret weapon crates, which was exciting. Kabuto took actual notes, but Naruto just pretended because he was not yet able to write. They then planned to steal the weapons and use the photos they took and the threat of sending them to T and I to blackmail the owner when Kabuto threatened imaginary people with T and I. It sounded frightening to Naruto, who had no idea what it was Kabuto could make those people visible, so he didn't even need to imagine them. That was a really awesome ninja art known as genjutsu. Even though he was exhausted the following day, the enjoyable evening was well worth it. Kabuto asked Naruto a lot of amusing questions during their second encounter. When Kabuto asked him, "Do you know what a chameleon is?" Kabuto informed him that it's a lizard that changes color depending on what it's on because he didn't know Naruto claimed that it sounded a lot like ninja. True, Kabuto laughed, but it sounded more like a dog's bark than joyful laughter. Naruto thought about this for a long time, but what color is a chameleon that's on a mirror? What color am I? Naruto didn't believe this was about Kabuto's silver hair, extremely pale skin, blue clothing, and how he appeared as a shadow and a glitter of moonlight in the night. He was unsure of the reason, but he had a gut feeling that Kabuto would find this extremely significant, and he needed to provide the correct response for friends. Friends came through. He said, "You are friend-colored," and Kabuto gave him a much friendlier smile. Naruto continued, encouraging, "And you are cool-colored and lots of knowledge-colored too." Kabuto straightened up and pushed the glasses up his nose in a way that gave the impression that he was very intelligent. Before Kabuto spent a year away on a mission, Naruto saw him 5 times. After he was paired with a medic nin and taught him how to be one as well, he saw Kabuto twice. However, Kabuto had a lot of missions and didn't have much time to play with his young friend. Things quickly took a turn for the worse after Naruto first saw him during the Chunin exams. He had essentially forgotten about the drop bag, but as soon as they released him from the hospital, he went to check their hidden location beneath the Hokage mountain. After failing to get Sasuke back, Kabuto's bag was missing, but his was present. It wasn't as painful as Sasuke's defection. It wasn't as painful as Haku's passing had been. However, it came in a close third. The concept of Uzumaki Naruto was successful. Although none of the colors he gave Kabuto were considered colors in the traditional sense, he was still happy with them. Friendship, coolness, knowledge, fun, and secrets. After that, he improved greatly at pretending to be sane in accordance with the Hidden Leaf standards. Perhaps, he thought, he wasn't completely pretending when he grinned at a vendor who gave him an extra apple and praised his amiable demeanor in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt warm and liberated in his action, as if he didn't need to measure every action before performing it. Amiable colored. It worked out because, as he discovered, being friendly worked with a lot of people in most circumstances, including during a mission. Smiling and being courteous unnerved his enemy more than his threats ever did. One of his senpai said, "Conflicting signals." Simply put, Kabuto was relieved to have a script from which he could not stray. Kabuto's final encounter with Naruto before departing for Iwa. To avoid connecting Kabuto's face to the Kyuubi Jinchuriki, they only engaged in ninja play after nightfall. That didn't sit well with Danzo-sama. He suspected this time. He used genjutsu in a small area to assist them in playing the role of recruiting for a spy company. Though he didn't seem to fully understand how he exploited people's vulnerabilities, he pointed out with some amusement that Naruto was actually incredibly skilled at recruiting using a real simulation. After the play was over for the evening, Naruto yelled, "When I'm big I'm gonna have my own secret ninja organization, and then you can be part of it too." Kabuto ruffled his hair and smiled as he asked, "Is that so?" Naruto squirmed out from under his hand with a little protest. "Yeah, and you have to promise you will be part of it. It's one of your colors. You know, always keeps promises to friends." Color? Naruto said with authority. He appeared to take pleasure in having the authority to choose Kabuto's colors. He nodded his head and confirmed, "So I am." Then, as he tried to remember the last time he had been asked to make a promise, he received numerous orders en route, but no promises were made to him because they implied trust. And Danzo-sama had no faith in anyone. Nono had been the last person he had promised. How much time had passed since he last considered her? Now that Naruto understood who and what he was to him, he no longer felt disjointed. "I promise that when you found a secret ninja organization, I will join it." Any promise was worth it. He knew that being so reliant on someone else's opinions wasn't exactly healthy, but it was better than who he had been before. Even the smell of freshly baked bread on her hands and Nono's smiles returned to his dreams. He would have referred to Nono as a mother in a different life. Sometimes he wondered what had happened to her. She had permitted him to adopt her last name, Yakushi. After visiting Iwa, Yakushi, Kabuto discovered that he had a human heart that was strong enough to shatter. He could hardly believe she did that. Nono, one of Danzo's, was Nono. However, Nono had loved him and didn't want to part with him by accepting that one mission. She had attempted to buy him free. What remained of Kabuto's sanity gave him hope after Yakushi Nono was betrayed and murdered by the same son she had attempted to free. Kabuto shared an enemy without authority for the first time in his life. Enemy was a knot so cold it burned inside the heart, and it was colored like the tang of blood on the tongue. Kabuto wasn't bothering with that loyalty because Naruto hadn't given him any for Konoha as a color. He gladly accepted Orochimaru's offer to exact revenge. Kabuto kept this a secret from him, but his new master frequently made fun of his true colors. The Snake Sanin, Danzo, and Sasori all had him, or believed they did. He was Naruto's friend and his color was a friend. He genuinely didn't think that friendship and serving Naruto's adversary were mutually exclusive. After all, what did allies and enemies matter? However, he was also something else. He would have to fulfill a commitment he made to Naruto. He had not been asked for any, after all, by Orochimaru. I swear that I will join any secret ninja organization you create. While Naruto-kun's evil was somewhat tempered by his propensity to be courteous to women, his love of young children, and the fact that he never actually terrorized anyone who didn't go out of their way to terrorize or arrest his precious people first, the people of Makimura believed that he was a Yakuza boss, strong as a monster, and clearly some sort of evil genius to have taken over in less than a week. This was nothing new, and Tsubaki was starting to realize that strange circumstances like this were part of Naruto's nature, much like how he felt sorry for and took in Kiri missing nin who were extremely desperate and potentially dangerous. Naruto was certain Kirigakure didn't care, arguing that two of the three didn't really count as missing nin because they hadn't graduated to become ninja in the first place. What was novel was that she was the result of an unexplained collective whimsy believed to be Naruto's maul. When she saw a man cautioning his friend against approaching the Yakuza boss's bird, "She ain't worth that," she asked Kaide-kun, who had the misfortune of being in her presence, "What is wrong with these people?" Naruto-kun is 13. She hissed angrily, putting aside their illusions about his moral nature. It was true that genin were regarded as legally adults in the majority of places, including Konoha, but there were different levels of legality, and that simply wasn't the case if it was somewhere else. The local legal system needed a major overhaul. Kaide-kun sympathized, saying, "People tend to have kind of lurid imagination. I mean, there were lots of people who whispered I was servicing Konatsu in return for her tutoring back in Kiri. Neither of us is 12 this day, and I'm not entirely sure all of them were unaware we are siblings." Tsubaki had to admit, with a wince in his heart, that charges of prostitution involving underage sibling incest were comparable to pedophilia. Since the small safe house was now unable to accommodate everyone involved, they were making their way down the street to the store that had become their base of operations, which did not exist. Now that she was aware of the rumors, Tsubaki noticed how many people actually gave her a nod as she passed by. She also recalled the deals she had found on food and almost everything else she had bought in Makimura. She also saw that none of the nodders were tourists, some of whom nodded so deeply that it was more like a bow than a nod. They were all locals. Kaide whispered, "Besides, they think we are Yakuza. I guess high moral standards aren't really expected of us," and exchanged a conversational glance with Tsubaki. "This can be used," it said, "because we get things cheaper and nobody bothers us. If we can talk Naruto into it, we might actually be able to do something illegal because money is always good." A Kiri look on the face of a boy far too young to be so cynical was extremely practical, but that was Kirigakure. Mists obscured cruel smiles and blood on the water. Tsubaki thought, "To the winner go the spoils," and slightly freaked out. A small, petty part of her would not have cared as much about the defamation of her character if these rumors had reached Mizuki. If only he would have come to believe that the person who beat him had gotten his woman. Even though the majority of her hoped to any god who might listen that no one in Konoha ever heard of this. Only now did she realize how much she still hadn't moved on from him and his betrayal. The critique of the loan economy is that we buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like. But what are we criticizing when the case is that we are ready to have people whose morals we deride to think ours are low as well? She pondered. Tsubaki realized she had asked it aloud when Kaide gave her a long look and made a tiny sound at the back of his throat. Eriko Matsuzaki was a man who enjoyed his comforts. He was respectable because he had a successful business and was comfortably wealthy. He lived in a nice, modern home with all the conveniences that tea country had to offer. He didn't have to buy coal to keep his home warm or buy ice from the ice vendor to keep his food cold. Although he was childless, his sister had children and grandchildren, which came in handy whenever he felt like spoiling someone. Then there was Sakuya, who lived next door to his oldest niece and was the widow of an old friend who knew. They had been flirting for some time. The days passed in a similar and serene manner. Or that's how they used to go. His priceless comfort zone had now been shattered into 1,000 tiny fragments. And the worst part was that he was largely to blame. Though it had landed him a great shipping deal, He should have known better than to let himself be lured into the ninja business. Furthermore, nothing significant ever occurred in Tea Country, much less Makima. It was a tourist trap with no natural resources, no strategic importance, and no connection to any significant trade routes. It was very nearly the largest thing going on, if not the largest thing was his delicacy trade. He had to tell his nieces, nephew, and Sakuya just yesterday that he had nothing to do with any Yakuza deals. It was just ninja, but they are the good guys, honest. That had gone horribly wrong in a way. His heart condition and the rest he was required to take were even advantageous because they provided him with a valid excuse to remain at home. He was not interested in finding out what people were saying about him to make matters worse. Sato Naruto and his entourage paid him a visit today. An older, but still youthful, woman with brown hair, a vest of some kind, and stern eyes was there. She was observing a man suspiciously in a yellow yukata that appeared to be a little too small on him. It was enhanced by a girl dressed in odd blue ninja attire. Thus, this was Naruto's family, or what the ninja community considered to be a group? Minions? A flock? Naruto said, "Hi, Matsuzaki, it's nice to see you are sitting up and stuff." Eriko was drinking iced tea in his living room while seated in his worn-out but cozy armchair. Although it had been a better day than the one before, nothing positive could endure. Of course, with a crazy smile, Naruto shoved a paper bag into his lap. "There are apple dumplings. We had a lot off applesauce because we made bombs. This is Tsubaki-chan. She's my senpai, and Miwa-chan, she's my assistant in all things, and Shrike, who isn't telling me his real name yet. He was a Kiri hunter nin, but I stole him." He introduced himself in a manner that seemed to be logical. Ariko buried his face in his hands and gave what he heard all the thought he could stand. "I don't even want to know. In a society that thinks in circles, it is difficult to think linearly." Naruto was aware of the common misconception that he was a little simple, but that was untrue. People insisted on making things much more complicated than they actually were, even though they were simple. Consider him and Kyuubi. For instance, Naruto desired affection. He obviously wasn't going to hurt anyone who didn't deserve it because he wouldn't be loved if he did. People should stop treating Naruto badly because they don't want him to hurt them, but a lot of people have never learned to use common sense. Naruto's sensible nature was a blessing for them. Iruka-sensei had come close, but even he failed to grasp it. Naruto was happy because, of course, happiness was preferable to misery. Even though it wasn't always simple, the only positive aspect of simplicity was that it was simple. It wasn't like his entire life was terrible or anything, and easy wasn't a synonym for happy. There were only a few individuals in it, and if those individuals included S-class criminals, well, those individuals and S-class criminals weren't synonymous with life. It was absurdly difficult to try to explain such things to Shrike, but Naruto was used to its circles and straight lines. Naruto waved briskly and hopped a little as a wasp zigzagged past his ear. Shrike glanced at him, but Naruto knew those were incredibly ill-tempered and would sting you for amusement. He told Shrike about his positive memories of using some for anti-Uchiha pranks prior to the massacre. Even Sharingan users found it challenging to avoid wasps because they didn't fly in a straight line. Instead, they zigzagged in patterns that changed constantly. This was because they were accustomed to avoiding projectiles that traveled in straight lines in a whole wasp colony. That was a fitting retribution. But Naruto had already seen that Shrike was not very good at having fun, so he said, "That guy totally deserved it. He kicked a little civilian girl's puppy when it grabbed his pant leg. And don't look at me like that, it was fun, anyway." He questioned, "Do you want to be unhappy?" Evidently, there were those who enjoyed suffering. He initially believed it was about Anbu when he read that one manuscript for Jiraiya after his proofreader quit, but it quickly became very strange. At least he now understood what the nut that went awry in Sasuke Tem's brain was, even though he could have lived his entire life without understanding what masochist meant, hopefully, only without the sexual aspect, as that sounds awful. "I wasn't unhappy," an insistent Shrike said. They were sitting on a bench in a park after Naruto surreptitiously snuck them both out of the safe house because he suspected Shrike wouldn't feel comfortable if Tsubaki-chan was staring at him. There was a shrine close by, and the area was lovely, with nearly overgrown paths. The trees appeared somewhat dejected. The tall red, yellow, and orange flowers were fighting hard, and Naruto wondered if anyone would mind if he took some with him. He assumed it might be because it was hot and there was no rain. Both Miwa-chan and Tsubaki-chan would later be upset with you for leaving her, but sometimes you had to come to terms with the fact that people would be upset with you. There was a good reason for it. Naruto questioned Shrike, "But you weren't happy either, and isn't not happy a synonym for unhappy?" The word synonym was surprisingly helpful. It greatly simplified the explanation of these concepts. The older man's face flushed red, and Naruto thought of Iruka, but not when he did it. Iruka smiled despite his red flush. Shrike's eyes glistened like amusingly colored flint fragments. Why you care? He asked in a shrill falsetto that was now almost unmanly, but there was something about it that made Naruto think of Kakashi-sensei's voice when he told his sensei about Sasuke and the Chidori, and it made him shiver. The one thing Naruto was not, however, was a coward. Naruto continued, knowing that Shrike would be challenging, saying, "Look, it's not like I just grabbed you because you can't get something for nothing, and I wanted you to not be so screwed up, so I had to give something in exchange. We are teammates now. I have a group of people who work with me, so I have a team. I stole you, so you are now part of the team, and that makes us teammates, so deal with it. I'm not gonna stop sheltering you, and if you want to join the fire brigade or do something else, like take up interpretive dance or something, I'm gonna support you, and that's non-negotiable." It had a sea scent, was moist like Kiri jutsu, and was incredibly liberating. "My name is Doihara Taiki. A circle is inferior to a straight line each and every time." In Makima, the idyllic beach resort town, it was another day of pure beauty. Birds were singing their tiny hearts away, the sea was blear and the sky was blue, and the golden beaches were crowded with gorgeous, and some not so beautiful, but that wasn't taken into account, women wearing tiny swimsuits. About 200 Narutos were currently in the city, doing various tasks in the two enormous former bordellos to transform them into real inns. The casino boat had been functional as is, but the interior design of a Yakuza cathouse was lacking. Although she would have liked to, Tsubaki wasn't out practicing with the fire department because water jutsu wasn't her strongest suit, and some of the things Taiki-san knew were just plain evil. She enjoyed watching Naruto and protecting him from danger, but she wasn't with him either. Tsubaki Ono was occupied with a report. Jiraiya was Naruto's sole supervisor at the moment, but she still needed to get in touch with Konoha, and that presented a challenge. She had a strong suspicion that Konoha would disapprove of the events in Makima. As she eyed the frighteningly white paper, she ate a delicious cinnamon apple dumpling. Ironically, even though ramen was Naruto's all-time favorite food and there was more instant ramen in the house than Tsubaki would have believed was needed to survive a month-long siege, he had made his friends, comrades, and followers totally dependent on apple dumplings. In addition to being the #1 most surprising ninja, he was also an incredibly skilled baker. She thought, I wish I could say this makes more sense in context, but after some thought, she realized that it didn't. Naruto was the only one present. Only in Naruto's tender care did this turn into a rather epic case of implicitly forbidden. Tsubaki was positive that Naruto wasn't doing anything that was specifically prohibited, if only because no one ever felt the need to forbid starting a legitimate business, forming a fire department, fighting Yakuza, or persuading foreign shinobi to defect. His current commanding officer had also never done so. Tsubaki also wanted this to be completed. It was perhaps she was a little maternal, although it was assumed that Naruto's parents had perished in the Kyuubi's attack on Konoha. No one knew who they were. The best way to describe Tsubaki's feelings, apart from some people's sick presumptions, would be as a proud mother watching her son make a name for himself. If Naruto had a father figure, it would be Iruka, and she didn't know how to best describe it unless she called it fealty. She pondered absently whether Iruka had done this intentionally, and when she finally woke up, she discovered that she had scrawled flowers and unidentified geometric shapes all over the paper. She sighed in its place. Of course, she could not simply lie. That would be caught for her. Even omissions would be detrimental. However, she might be able to omit certain details to make them appear more normal than they actually were. Since Matsuzaki Eriko, see Jiraiya-sama's contacts, T-Country for more information, had to take sick leave due to a heart attack and was told to rest, I have helped Uzumaki Naruto manage the company he took over. Additionally, Uzumaki-san has worked to better the neighborhood by assisting in the establishment of a by acting to create a fire department that was excellent, that was honorable and public-minded, and it had nothing to do with breaking cover, even though that was what had truly occurred. Morino Idate was simple. Ibiki himself, a Wasabi family member, would assist her in covering that when the three mists left the water country to immigrate. There was her report, which was purposefully deceptive while technically correct. Naturally, this wouldn't work in a century if it weren't for Jiraiya-sama. Jiraiya-sama would have to keep her out of trouble as well because he wouldn't want Naruto to get into any. From the empty room, she questioned, we are heavy, aren't we? She could see him standing in front of him in that silly orange jumpsuit, blushing a little, and scratching his head shyly, while smiling like the sun. You have to take responsibility of a lot of people with a lot of baggage. But it's weight you carry well. I don't think your dream of becoming a Hokage is so far-fetched as many think. At this point, was she a mother figure, a devoted follower, a friend who would rather see it than Naruto, or something else entirely? Sometimes the simplest things in a complex world were the most difficult to explain. At least she could honestly tell herself that she was not a traitor, even though it didn't feel completely easy, not easy at all. Actually, additionally, there were instances when breaking the rules was preferable to following them. She didn't know if she would ever have children, and Mizuki had never given her any. However, the victor had, in a sense, reaped the rewards. Tsubaki was akin to a mother, and it was all because of the person who had defeated Mizuki. She was taken aback by how a tight, painful knot in her chest relaxed and how liberated and wonderful it made her feel. Naruto was so accustomed to being regarded with amusement that he was oblivious to the suspicious glances he got from the Makimura residents. Yes, familiarity breeds contempt, but so does contempt, and he largely ignored the question of what he had done to earn it. When a mother with a baby crossed the street as he was walking home, his expectations were readily met by the Makimura adults. To the dismay of their long-suffering parents, however, Naruto had developed a small fanbase of kids who believed he was the greatest thing ever. The young girl in the yellow yukata was the first, and he saved her cat after it had climbed a torii. Naturally, the girl told her friends about the nice Ni-san while she was playing a lot in the park. Naruto felt a little old being called Ni-san, but he climbed a tree for the lot to prove he could when little Riza-chan was upset that her friends were calling her a lying liar, hem on fire. One of the girls then felt sorry for a little boy from the town's impoverished side named Hiro-kun, who was much too thin and ran outside without shoes. After she began feeding him, Mariko-chan asked Naruto if Hiro-kun could do a few light tasks for the constructors. Naruto was up to his eyebrows in little children before Hiro could say, "Frog." To the other children he saw following him around, he simply created some clones and had them engage in ninja combat with his tiny fans. He didn't mind. The adult was now experiencing extreme anxiety, although they warned their kids to avoid Sato because he was a bad man. Only the most compliant of them did so. Their parents were obviously mistaken because Naruto Ni was clearly not a man. So why did they go around calling him that? He wasn't bad because he played with them despite being one of the older kids, could have formed his own team, and always smiled without yelling at them. Before his first week in Makimura ended, Naruto was believed to be a Yakuza leader. Only when a new child joined the group on day 15 did he begin to realize that something amusing was happening. What were the parents thinking about Sato Atsushimaru? That poor boy coincidentally had the same last name as his alter ego, which is the most popular last name in T-Country. His smile was so adorable that he attempted to bite Naruto when he said it. He was small, with a gap where one of his milk teeth had fallen out. Naruto took to him right away. They were in a park with one of Naruto's clones, not the real one, when a young, agitated-looking man in a police uniform ran toward them. He begged his son, Atsushimaru, "Please come here, we need to go home," and he held out his hand before approaching them very slowly, as though he didn't want to frighten any untamed animals. He smiled and held out his hand, saying, "So you are Maru-kun's father? I'm Sato Naruto. It's nice to meet you." However, his smile vanished when he saw how sickly and gray the man's face was, and how even his lips had turned completely white. As Naruto became perplexed and suspicious, Naruto was busy changing the wallpaper in the former whorehouse with the assistance of the girls, Miwa-chan, Idate, and himself, all the while attempting to keep glue out of his hair. He asked Idate, "How are the girls' lessons going?" In order to expand their chakra stores and facilitate jutsu training, he had asked his friends to teach his fire department taijutsu. Since self-defense was always beneficial and life could be dangerous in a large place like Makimura, the other girls had joined in as well. He and Idate could teach them how to defend themselves, but he couldn't stay here forever to keep them safe. Even if they practiced diligently after he left, the girls would likely only reach genin level, but that was more than enough to fend off typical muggers and creeps. Idate responded, "They are very motivated," and raised his head from his knees beneath the window. He unrolled a length of each boring neural brown and white roll and compared it to the others in good light to double-check that they were the same color. One of the girls exclaimed, "We do our best, of course." From the top of the ladder, the largest room in the house, the lobby, was where they were. She was hanging a new lamp from the ceiling, and the windows were small, so there wasn't much light. Another, Yuriko-chan, walked past him and said in a low, lilting voice, "We are going to make you so proud of us." Despite her unsightly gray apron and bucket of glue, she had a radiant smile, and Naruto blushed slightly when she touched his hand. The girls particularly enjoyed making fun of him, saying, "Anything for you, Naruto-kun." It was somewhat awkward, but at least Ero-sensei wasn't there to rib him to death over it. "I think we should have a small party once this work is done, Naruto-kun, to celebrate your new enterprise," said Miwa-chan. Despite her joyful tone, she was giving Yuriko-chan a kunai glare. Idate dutifully said, "That would be great," and gave Miwa-chan a fresh roll. "We could shop for supplies together. I haven't seen that much of Makimura yet." This business was definitely worth a party. Naruto was aware that it was named after him, but it was called the Sato Corporation because he was not allowed to reveal his true name to anyone. He was aware that a great legend was being born. first as a bridge and later as a corporation. He simply had the impression that a storm was approaching, and Naruto had never been scared of storms. He refused to acknowledge that his smile was foxy, but it was full of teeth. Treason was being planned by Doihara Taiki. Being a Kiri hunter nin, he was well aware of how challenging it could be to leave the village. You were owned by the village from the moment you entered the Kirigakure Ninja Academy, body and soul. And you were only allowed to leave in a body bag. Mizushima Konatsu was no longer a bother, nor was her brother. They weren't worth much research, and they weren't even fully graduated. All he had to do was write home to inform them that there were now 2 unnamed graves in Tea Country, and that would be it. He was a different matter entirely. It was a waiting game he was required to play until Sannin Jiraiya came back so he could properly defect to Naruto's superior officer and be placed on probation in Konoha's registry. He would then stop being Kiri's internal issue and be included in the larger issue known as Konoha. It would make him safer, though not exactly safe. If he was fortunate, he would be able to wriggle his way into that cozy niche where it would be pointless to try to reach him. Despite being a hunter nin, he had not established himself. The fact that Doihara Taiki was no longer a Kiri shinobi would not be known or significant to the general public. His old village would not look foolish. However, he needed an excuse to stay in Makima because he had just under 50 days left before he could do that. Tsubaki walked behind him and asked, "What are you doing?" Taiki wasn't totally comfortable facing someone who looked at him so suspiciously, but he had no choice because the Konoha Junin was superior to him in this peculiar little commune and its unofficial hierarchy. He honestly replied, trying to come up with a good lie, while he gazed at the white paper while waiting for Naruto to return from the building that was being rebuilt. They tried to pass the time in the safe house. Tsubaki, the only person besides Naruto who had a chance against him in a single battle, was watching him while he waited. Tsubaki sighed and took a seat again. "I see," he said. Taiki suspected she actually did. He might be looking into something that might endanger Kiri, but it wouldn't be serious enough to warrant him being sent back up. Something that was somewhat relevant to Kiri, even from Tea Country, but that took time to thoroughly investigate. Perhaps a cult would work? A connection to the Jinchuriki, perhaps? With his newfound inspiration, the plan came together effortlessly. Although it wasn't a direct threat because the cult promoted universal love and world peace, the word Jinchuriki always raised awareness. According to the cult leader, the Jinchuriki were actually living saints who defended the world against the Biju and would eventually guide the elemental countries toward a time of prosperity and peace. Anyone who knew the Mizukage and how the other villages used their living cages as living weapons would have laughed at this statement, but what could you expect from a backwater nut job guru? And he only needed a few weeks to get inside the cult properly to make sure it was as harmless as it sounded. He scribbled on the paper he had joined a cult, and Konatsu and Kaide were now dead in a good day's work, that is. In a tiny, filthy inn-room, Jiraiya sat cross-legged, sipping sake and wondering how his misbehaving pupil was doing. He was aware that Tea Country was as safe as they could get outside of Konoha's boundaries and that Amino Iruka wouldn't have graduated a total moron. But this was Naruto. He had long since concluded that Naruto's success at gambling was some sort of karmic compensation for his poor life. Luck. Naruto would undoubtedly be caught in the crossfire of any accident, incident, attack, or disaster that occurred within 5 miles of him. Jiraiya had not supported Naruto during his childhood. This was due in part to the fact that he had been genuinely extremely busy, but also in part to the fact that it had been painful to watch someone who was so similar to both Kushina and Minato at the same time. And he had a lot of experience avoiding pain. He had planned to make up for his previous neglect by taking care of his friend's son when he had accepted Naruto as a student, but naturally, Iwa of all places had to start acting out. The only reason Iwagakure hadn't attacked Konoha yet after the Chunin exam invasion was because they hadn't fully recovered from the losses of the previous war, so they weren't exactly at the height of their power either. The hidden villages had received conflicting signals from that commotion. On the one hand, a village was clearly strong if it could defeat an invasion of 2 villages, one of which was a Big 5 village, in a single afternoon. However, a village that had lost its cage needed to be made weaker. It had taken him several weeks to realize that Iwa was currently experiencing a great deal of plausible deniability. The Tsuchikage could declare some of his elite Junin missing nin and call it a day if things didn't work out, and he wasn't even officially aware of their plans. Politics, that mistress enjoyed wearing gags, blindfolds, whips, and chains. Perhaps a new icha about some Iwa Junin who happened to look exactly like some Iwa high-ups and a kinky, busty noblewoman dominatrix. That kind of thing always made the Tsuchikage go crazy. The abundance of barely disguised insults that could be used was the second best thing about writing porn naturally, with plausible deniability. In this instance, A missing nin was contacted by an unidentified Iwa personage regarding a job totally unremarkable. Unless you thought that missing nin was affiliated with Akatsuki, this didn't help the situation. But Jiraiya was pretty sure Iwa wasn't up to date with that Red Dawn. Akatsuki is the enemy of both him and, more significantly, Naruto. Here's to you. Naruto, wait some more weeks yet, he said, raising a glass to the vacant room. Golden red patches were painted on the off-white walls by the sunrise that crept in through the small window. He was just inebriated enough to make it feel very significant and symbolic. Matsuzaki had been suspiciously silent, but if only his loyal network would bring back some news from Makima. Oh well, surely no news was good news. To hell with hope, perhaps he ought to write to Tsunade and request a report. Mizushima Konatsu and her brother celebrated their deaths on the same day. Their old life had come to an end, but something new was still lurking on the horizon. Their new boss, who was totally addicted to the food, brought a huge bowl of takeout ramen for the private party. Miwa brought apple dumplings, along with a fresh batch of apple bombs in her scroll that were going to explode when they hit the ground. Tsubaki senpai, and she also brought tea with a small amount of sake. And Kiri, you were old enough to drink when you were old enough to kill for the village, and if you drank enough to kill your liver or to be killed quickly, you were clearly too stupid to live anyhow. Cleansing of the gene pool with alcohol assistance. It wasn't that foolish of Konatsu, since alcohol was destroyed by boiling. She had added sake straight to the boiling water, leaving only the bitter aftertaste. Her brother's liver would also stay completely virginal until he turned 16 if he didn't want his head smashed in for her. Being able to afford to essentially discard the alcohol that gave her comfort was a luxury. Instead of looking at her, Kaide leaned back against his arm and asked, "Are we going to stay here, Natsu?" As the sun sank behind the roofs in a fiery ball of amber and red, although there wasn't much of a porch at the house, it was still a nice spot to sit. The memory made Konatsu's mouth twitch, and the ground was still recovering from the beating it had sustained when Naruto had defeated Taiki. "For now at least, this isn't a bad place to regroup," she said casually. They had successfully escaped with their lives. She still found it difficult to believe that it had been this simple, but they were in a quiet and interesting nation, supervised by a very strong, if somewhat unique, young shinobi who had studied under one of the Sannin. They had a job that would cover their own housing in a few months, and they were formally dead. Although it would be ideal if they could safely rub this in their father's face, living was preferable to fleeting satisfaction. Kaide sipped his tea and remarked, "That's good, I like it here, and some of those girls show real promise. They weren't all bad, and they would eventually make respectable fighters for civilians." It was true. She had no intention of becoming a firefighter, but she would continue to train with Taiki and discipline those girls to help her figure out what she wanted to do with her life. Who knew? Perhaps Naruto would assign her some actual combat work in a few years, and when they were older, he might be open to a fling. Although Konatsu wasn't as enamored as some of his rescuees, it was clear that he had good genes and that their child would be amazing. She was about to say something polite and unimportant when a voice behind them sounded from the house, rattling the freshly repaired windows. "What you mean? They think I'm a Yakuza boss." Kaide chuckled. Oh dear, somebody clued him in, though because it had been so much fun to watch the misunderstandings lead to new, intriguing misunderstandings, he and Konatsu hadn't been particularly eager to tell Naruto what people truly thought of him. "So do you think we should tell him he's a cult leader too?" she inquired. They couldn't quite hear what was being said through the closed door, and the volume of the conversation inside had decreased. Kaide suggested, "Maybe we should leave that to another day?" and gave her a toast. Her stomach still warmed. Even though the tea was now only lukewarm, she was in a very relaxed mood on this pleasant, mild night. It was now evident that Naruto could hear him say, "I will make friends with them and show them I'm not a criminal. This is a promise." To the door, the idea of how that would go down nearly made Konatsu snort the remaining tea up her nose, and Kaide genuinely burst out laughing. He suggested, "How about we make a bet, Natsu? How many people will beg for their lives before Naruto is through befriending them?" She saw Kaide laugh, smile, and perform live. Kaide had the will to live but the inability to fight her because he had been teased for having a unisex name until he used his practice kunai to stab one of the bullies. Now her brother would be alive. She would give Naruto one of her two amazing children in exchange. After yet another day of fruitless searches for something they could arrest Sato Naruto for, Yamamoto Takumo came home a frustrated man. There had been a rather grating absence of overt law breaking after the initial carnage had stopped. He had no idea that Sato was involved in drug dealing, money laundering, and extortion. He seemed to have a very negative opinion of prostitution, but it was clear that he had a ninja background because it had never been this hard to find even the most believable signs of organized crime. A part of him was even glad it was so hard. At least he didn't have to wonder how they were going to arrest the boy man for the time being. It didn't make him happy at all to be so pitifully happy about this. As she peered through the kitchen door, Reiko questioned, "That bad today?" He did so and felt a little better right away because she was wearing a pink apron with the words "Kiss the Cook" printed on it. He let his shoulders rest and said, "It's good to be home, dear. Where's Ruka-chan?" The kitchen was filled with the wonderful aroma of ginger and fish. Reiko responded, "She's finally sleeping in her cradle. She's been really restless today. I think she may be teething," and motioned for him to take a seat. It was a lovely scene, intimate, cozy, and domestic naturally. It was too good to be true when Takumo opened the door after a loud knock. The kind words of greeting turned to ashes as he saw the happy face of Sato Naruto, holding a basket. "Sato-san," he stumbled, his mind shifting to his wife and his young daughter, who was too young to comprehend the danger her father had placed her in. How stupid he'd been. A shinobi would not consider such an action to be more trouble than it was worth just because old Seihara had never tried to kill him. As he slipped past Takumo without waiting for permission, Sato was beaming and said, "Hey, I'm Sato Naruto and you are Yamamoto Takumo, right? It's nice to meet you. Can I come inside?" A girl and a boy of about the same age were standing behind him despite their diminutive size. They both carried blades in plain sight and walked with the lethal grace of large cats. Sato gave his beautiful, courageous wife the basket and said, "And you are Yamamoto-san's wife, right? Here, this is for you." Despite her pale face, Reiko accepted the gift with a resolute expression on her lips. The basket contained a bottle and a small paper package that was most likely filled with dry goods. Naruto turned back to face Reiko after she thanked him in a voice that barely shook. He began, "So, I found out you have these really funny ideas about me," and Takumo abruptly stopped talking. He had never pleaded for mercy in his life, but his family had never been threatened before. "Please don't, there are plenty of crimes to busy myself with in a town the size of Makima. Please leave my family in peace." He could spit in the face of the shinobi yakuza and at least lose his honor if it were just him. Even he had his price, though, and the hatred he felt for himself for what he had just offered burned in his stomach like raw alcohol. He simply couldn't handle the idea of his family being killed or worse, and he knew that any yakuza worth his first ryo could create something even worse. It didn't sound promising at all when the unnamed girl whispered something to the boy that sounded like, "First time." Sato objected, his face contorting into a very realistic facsimile of hurt. "I'm going to befriend you." At first, Naruto wasn't sure exactly how he was going to persuade the chief of police of his innocence. He couldn't very well fight a civilian. That just wouldn't be sporting, but usually demonstrating your strength to kick someone's ass got them to listen. The scene would resemble Neji assaulting Hinata-chan. He would require a corrective kick to the back after doing something similar. At least for the ninja, asking someone to train with you was the way to make friends in Konoha. Since he had never had a civilian friend prior to beginning C-rank missions outside of the village, where making friends primarily involved defending them, Naruto was somewhat confused about how the civilians accomplished this. He had never seen a movie before, but right before their incredibly amazing mission where he got to save his first princess, Kakashi-sensei ordered his team to watch Princess Funa training. Spar was a fun activity for him. He was amiable when he ate with Iruka-sensei, but he wasn't into going to cafes or restaurants. No one could turn him away outright, but the service was typically so cold that it made his eyebrows freeze. In Naruto's life, friendship and martial arts were almost synonymous in the end. He simply made the decision to tone them down and soften them a little. "You know I'm training a fire brigade, right? Well, the Great Naruto Fire Brigade hereby challenges the Makima Police Department to a sports day. We will have all kinds of competition, like hitting the bullseye and swimming and races, and I'm not even letting Idate compete in that because it would be unfair. It will be fun and friendly." He was being stared at by Yamamoto and his wife. Their mouth was slightly open, and their eyes were bugged. Even though Naruto was accustomed to amusing looks, Kiba's suggestion that they adhere the practice kunai to the academy's ceiling was so absurd that it was beyond reasonable comprehension. He scowled, wondering what it might be. Perhaps Yamamoto believed it was stupid for girls to compete against his police. As Naruto thought about that possibility, a tiny storm cloud started to form over his head. Just out of principle, he would ask Tsubaki-chan and Konatsu-chan to join in as well and kick everyone's asses if that were the case in hidden villages. Everyone learned early on that being told you fought like a girl was not an insult, and the girls were willing to prove it at any time. It was one thing to be told you fought like a fangirl, but even that one was far more offensive to non-fangirls than to boys. "Is this some kind of gender prejudice thing?" asked the man. Although he was still gaping, Yamamoto appeared appropriately alarmed at the idea. "Because there is nothing wrong being a female. Half of humanity is female. Your wife is a female. You don't want to insult her, do you?" His wife, whose name he had not yet heard, had tilted her head slightly and closed her mouth. She gave him a fierce look as if she were attempting to see right through him like a Hyuga. Naruto rubbed the back of his head and smiled sheepishly, finding it somewhat unsettling. Therefore, it seemed that he needed to persuade the police that girls weren't weak in addition to proving that he wasn't a criminal. Yamamoto's wife would likely force him to sleep on the couch as a form of punishment for his chauvinism, but his girls were capable of handling the situation. He felt the warm satisfaction that comes from a job well done, especially when Iruka-sensei, Kakashi-sensei, or even Ero-sensei gave him praise one moron at a time. He was going to improve Makimura's quality of life, or at least the world. Yakushi Nono once told her surrogate son that there are some things that cannot be measured. You won't find love, loyalty, or soul if you break a human down to the atomic level. Certain things are only perceptible. Even ninjas occasionally have to settle for regular postal services. Doihara Taiki's letter traveled 2 days over the waves in a postal ship because he lacked a summon contract and any kind of ninja animals. Hakasuicho, a small port town, was its destination because, according to old legend, the wind blew the water there white. The highly encrypted report was sent by a Kiri agent named Akira in Hakasuicho. However, his village was unaware that the humble Chunin, who felt underappreciated and underpaid, was also a part of the notorious Sound Leader's information network and carefully copied everything he said. He had a basic instrument, 2 sheets of glass and a bright lamp beneath them, but he was unable to shatter the signet. He read the letter through the paper after sliding the envelope between the layers and turning on the lamp. The kanji overlapped and the paper was folded, making it difficult, but he handled it with the skill of extensive practice. The report waited 2 more days in the tiny Hakasuicho outpost for a courier nin to come by because it wasn't marked as busy, classified, or for eyes only. 7 days after their dispatch, both the original and the copy arrived at their destination, one on the table of Otogakure's head of intelligence, Yakushi Kabuto, and the other in Kiri's mission office. At a small, quiet celebration held by the Mizushima family to commemorate the redemption of their family's honor through extreme means, Kabuto knocked on the door of one of Orochimaru's laboratories. He had deliberately chosen this moment. Orochimaru was constantly sidetracked by the statistical analysis of gene transfer using various recombinant viruses. Orochimaru said impatiently from behind the closed door, "What is it, Kabuto?" Kabuto pushed it open and entered. The light in the lab was blindingly bright and white. As the light bounced off the amber and green liquids within, jars greeted him with a vibrant glow. They contained brains, eyes, lungs, and hearts. However, color-coded files containing the raw data from the current experiment as well as the statistics from multiple earlier ones took up most of the room today. As he flipped through a few different pages on multiple ledger sheets in 2 separate ledger books arranged on a side table, Orochimaru gave him a stern look. His voice was smooth, and he bowed his head. "Orochimaru-sama, I have received an intelligence report that I believe demands my presence in T-Country," he said, finding the weak and mistreated, the diamonds in the rough, and then claiming their unwavering allegiance for himself was Orochimaru's strategy in their own eyes. Their only value was what they could offer their Orochimaru-sama, but nothing is free. The result of this strategy was that Orochimaru, who was inherently suspicious and cynical, had grown extremely complacent in his belief in the loyalty of his followers. The irony, oh. With a sharp dismissal, Orochimaru said, "Do as you feel you must," and returned to his papers even behind his back. Kabuto showed no signs of smiling. It wouldn't be this simple normally, but at the moment, the Shodem Otokage would only find it annoying if a bomb went off in the hallway. Kabuto experienced a peculiar sense of fulfillment that he felt he would like to further investigate. Although Sato Naruto was mentioned in the report, Kabuto had improved his intuition and attention to detail over time. Naruto and a Jinchuriki cult in the same sentence was too coincidental. He was a Yumami, a dreamgazer, whose dreams whispered of real things. As if some benign spirit had whispered to his ear, there was no doubt in his mind that Naruto was finally remembering him. "Maybe I should take the Uchiha with me," he suggested. "He has been demanding lately." At this point, Orochimaru didn't want to be demanding. The slightest glint in his eyes was concealed by the glint of light on the glass as he pushed his glasses up his nose. The snake signing didn't even hesitate, which was the best evidence that Orochimaru was taking him for granted. The same day that Doihara Taiki's letter was dropped off in a postal ship, Ono Tsubaki's letter was dropped off in a post cart. 5 days later, the letter arrived at a small Konoha outpost in the Fire Country, and a messenger hawk flew it to the village in just 1 day. Just before Amino Iruka's shift ended, the report arrived at the mission desk. He read it, grinned, and was pleased to see that Naruto was content with his leisure time and getting along with the locals and actual fire department. He was maturing well. When Danzo received a copy of the report the following morning, he knew something didn't smell right because he had been instructed to keep him updated on everything that affected the Jinchuriki. In his written and verbal reports, He was Konoha's unofficial but undeniable champion of skirting the truth in a way that caused the poor concept to faint from vertigo. He was unable to identify a single word or sentence, but the entire thing practically shouted, plausible deniability. The stench reached the highest levels when combined with Jiraiya's letter, which requested updates on Uzumaki because his informant in Makima had not informed him. Was Ono really working with Orochimaru? Was Uzumaki taken prisoner or turned? With the woman, Sandaime had been far too trusting, and Godem had unwisely followed his lead. He said, "Your name for the purpose of this mission is Sai," to ID Route 522, a young shinobi who was kneeling in front of his desk. "You have successfully completed a C-class escort mission, the details of which are in this file. On your way to Konoha you will stop in Makimura and surreptitiously make contact with Uzumaki, assuming he is still in the town, and find out his true circumstances. There, be prepared to eliminate Junin Ono if she shows signs of treachery." He handed over a manila folder and his agent rose to take it. His operative said, "Yes, Danzo-sama," and stood there vigilantly but with a submissive body language. The pale face was flawless and emotionless, like that of a porcelain doll. Danzo scowled. He had chosen one of the root-raised operatives for the mission because they were his most devoted followers and, to the extent that he trusted anyone, the most trusted. The exact opposite of Uzumaki, who was raised with strict discipline and had no goals other than the mission and Konoha's best interests, whose steel hadn't been chipped and dulled by people's senseless prejudice, was born because Uzumaki had demonstrated a remarkable ability to build rapport and compromise with people who had similar past experiences to his own. Danzo wanted to keep the common frame of reference as small as possible since nothing en route was personal, not even their own selves. Personal tragedies never happened there. However, this had the drawback that the root-raised were rarely good at pretending to be human. When he said, "Smile," the operative's mouth turned up and he let his eyelids close. Danzo had to suppress a scowl. The operative appropriately interpreted this as a dismissal and departed, leaving Danzo to handle the remainder of his reports. Practice that in front of a mirror and buy a book on human interaction. You are not to allow the target to engage in ethical debate with you under any circumstance. Do you have questions? Jiraiya believed that a number of high-ranking Iwagakure Junin were collaborating with Kakuzu, a Takigakure missing nin who was now thought to be a member of the elusive Akatsuki. They seemed intent on killing a powerful genin team leader with political ties and accusing Tsunagakure of hiring Kakuzu, presumably in the hopes that Tsuna's collaboration with the man who attempted to kill Shodem following the Chunin exam invasion would incite Konoha to declare war on the other side. Because Sarutobi Asuma was Sandaime's son and his genin were all future leaders of their powerful clans, Jiraiya had reduced the number of potential targets to him and his group. This would need to be handled, but the circumstance could also arise. After all, the framing game could be played by multiple players. He had been watching a young Iwa Junin named Idarafura while he was already a class and could become S-class in a few years, making him an asset that Iwa could not afford to keep. According to his spies, the young Junin was reportedly codependent with a young Chunin from his village and had some emotional instability. Perhaps he would blame his teacher and cage if the girl died and it turned out to be Kakuzu's work. There was certainly room for possibility. So, believing that the Uzumaki situation was under control, at least for the time being, Danzo focused on doing everything in his power to turn a bad situation to Konoha's advantage. He might have been a little less confident if he had known that Personhood, the Art of Being Fully Human, the book the newly renamed Sai had purchased, was actually a religious work about soul enlightenment written by the head of a small cult that practiced free love, rather than a psychology book. With the assistance of the inn and casino boat girls, the fire department girls in Makimura were getting ready for the sports festival the following day. The event ended up falling on the same day as the opening of the town's 2 new inns because Naruto took so long to obtain approval from the mayor, the Makimura Municipal Council, and the police chief. Locals were fleeing in terrified circles while tourists reveled in the excitement. Miwa had never considered herself to be the type to take pleasure in pettiness, but she was enjoying watching them worry about the sweetest, most gentle person she had ever met. In preparation for the festival, tents were being set up, the arena was being prepared close to their regular beach practice area, and some of the inn girls were baking. She told a few of her friends, "Move it to the right a bit now, it's good." Regarding the podium's placement, she wanted a lovely backdrop for photos, and it would have been ruined if rooftops had peeked over the tree line. "Phew. Now it's all done," Yuriko said, wiping away her perspiration and grinning at their success. She oversaw the new Fireheart Inn and was Miwa's closest friend. Miwa wished she could be as beautiful for a moment while the wind played with her long, black hair. Then perhaps Naruto-kun would. "Life sure has been grand lately, hasn't it?" Yuriko chuckled, in a lovely voice. A voice called behind her, "Ah, Miwa-chan." You look fine. At her Miwa turned toward it and looked directly into Morino Idate's eyes. He shifted his weight from one leg to the other while holding a small package in his hands that was wrapped in bright red silk paper. She inquired, wondering what she might have ordered and then forgotten. What have you got there? She asked. Tsubaki-senpai was handling everything related to the final fireworks. The food was covered, so it couldn't be spices. The ribbons for the award ceremony were there. The new uniforms had only arrived yesterday, and the package was much too small anyhow. As befitted the victor of the Todoroki shrine race, Idate said, I hope you like it. Let's eat together tomorrow. Thrust the package into her hands, and swiftly left the area. Miwa arched an eyebrow and cautiously unfolded the rustling paper of Bura. A long hairpin with metal strips fastened to the body of the pin by rings was inside. Miwa could only think, oh shush tea, as they tinkled sweetly in the wind. She asked Yuriko, any ideas on how to let a guy down nicely? Idate was an important member of their group, teaching them how to defend themselves, and Miwa was certain that his ties to the Wasabi family would be worth a lot in the future. Although she didn't want to alienate him, she wasn't used to saying no and was positive that doing so would only make her seem rude. Naruto-kun trusted her to take care of his business because she couldn't afford crude. In a sympathetic yet mildly humorous tone, Yuriko said, Miwa dear, I know you are head over heels for Naruto-kun, but have you at any point asked him about his age? Miwa's whole life came to a halt as the Bura ting-a-ling-a-ling sounded, filling the sky. She hadn't inquired, however. Naruto-kun was a shinobi, so he must have gained some age points to match his years. She inquired, how old is he? She was only 16, so it wasn't like she was that old either. 15 would be fine, and 14 would be a little troublesome right now, but in another year, the gap would appear to be less pronounced. The Bura went ting-a-ling-a-ling. She said in a nice but somewhat self-deprecating way, 13. You didn't think I decided to forego the race for his heart because I don't like orange, did you? Even though the sentence made grammatical sense and every word was obviously understandable, the entire thing was insane. Only 13. At the age of 13, Naruto-kun had defeated the entire Yakuza family, defeated Seihara at the height of his strength, and saved them all. He had also engaged in combat with that Kiri Junin, who, if she had understood correctly, was the highest ninja rank outside of Cage 13. He was a little short, all right, but 13. This was similar to learning that when the world was created, the great Kami Izanagi was still in diapers. Miwa moaned loudly, 13. Why are all the good ones taken, gay or 13? And then flinched as every head in her immediate vicinity turned to face her. Over the sound of the wind and the slight crackle of her heart, she muttered, there really isn't any way to make that sound a little less perverted, is there? He didn't want to offend Idate, but she would never be able to wear it again, even though it was a beautiful ornament. Naruto cherished celebrations. He cherished the Lantern Floating Festival, Tanabata, Hanami, the Konoha Cherry Blossom Festival, and the New Year's Festival. Now that he had some understanding of why people were so much more horrid toward him than usual that night, he even held a special place in his heart for the Kyuubi's demise anniversary. All Makimura would witness the great Naruto Fire Brigade versus Makimura Police. Sports Day, the pinnacle of public-minded fitness. Today, it was made even better by the opening of the Peaceful Rest Inn and the Fire Heart Inn. Despite protesting that the name Peaceful Rest sounded like the name of a cemetery, Taiki and Konatsu-chan were voted to simply be morbid in that way, Kiri influence and all. Nor had it been simple to organize. Talking to the police chief was sufficient. He then needed to speak with the mayor. As soon as he was sent to Konatsu and Kaide, the mayor entered there, begging count, and the Makimura Municipal Council increased it to 4. Giving every police officer a free day on the same day turns out to be a bad idea, and no one trusts your Cage Bunshin to enforce the law when they believe you are involved in organized crime. Konatsu snickered, and Kaide gave her a thud on the head. Don't worry, we barely approach organized on a good day. Konatsu said it had done absolutely no good. But finally, the day had arrived. Wandering between the ramen and candy stands, tourists were making purchases and remarking on how unique it was that women were employed to fight fires. Yamamoto was selected from the crowd by Naruto's gaze, and he approached the man when Naruto yelled his greeting and seized his arm. Yamamoto, who was staring around wildly, jumped. Naruto grimaced when he scowled, which was completely unnecessary, but Naruto enjoyed making contact with people. As Iruka-sensei had once described him, he was the kinetic type. Instead of reading or listening, he preferred to learn by doing. He enjoyed clinging to people and hugging them, as well as receiving friendly shoves from his sparring partners after a fight and thwacks to the head from Sakura-chan. When praise was given with a hand ruffling his hair, it always sounded the best. Naruto was aware that being touched by someone you believed to be malevolent could be frightening. Kakashi-sensei had referred to this as psychological warfare, but since his enemies had never been sentimental and it was easy to forget, he didn't really have any experience with that. He said, "Come watch the kunai throwing competition," and continued to hold the man while pulling him along with him. He should just act naturally because the goal of this was to make friends. Thanks to Tsubaki-chan's guidance and learning about the competition a week in advance, the girls emerged victorious in the first one. Even at close range, their accuracy wasn't the best, but they were able to hit the target with the kunai's blade and, more crucially, consistently. The men in police uniforms struck it with the handle just as frequently as they did with the blade, and if the kunai did not stay, the hit was not considered. The girls jumped at each other's necks as the crowd, which consisted entirely of tourists and his local child following, cheered the overwhelming victory. They looked fantastic in their new uniforms, which included pants with ninja-style ankle bandages and a high-collared coat with tight, buttoned sleeves. Choosing to be a cool and polite winner, he asked the policeman, "Huh, I guess you don't throw kunai here, this not being a hidden village? You should, you can do cool things with them, and senbon. I met this really strong ninja called Haku, he, or she, it was kind of ambiguous, he dressed like a girl, but he said she was a he, had this really strong ice bloodline and he could throw senbon so it stopped Sasuke's heart and lungs and suppressed his chakra, but still didn't really kill him for a while, and I kind of lost it." At this point, Naruto turned his face away from the laughing, cheering girls to the man he was speaking to. Noticing that Yamamoto's face had turned decidedly pale. Sadly, he had overlooked Tsubaki-chan's golden rule of getting along with civilians, which states that you should never discuss business. Never. "But I didn't kill him, I mean, Haku did die, but he changed his mind in the middle of it, so I didn't do it and I'm not helping myself, am I?" Naruto looked downcast. Kakashi-sensei had always told him to stop his rambling 2 sentences sooner. He had truly messed up this one, but perhaps the police chief would decide he wasn't so frightening after all if he appeared sufficiently pathetic when he gave them puppy dog eyes. No one ever took him seriously. Like a fish on dry land, Yamamoto's mouth was opening and closing, but he was unable to speak. Naruto wanted to give him a reassuring pat on the hand, but regrettably concluded that perhaps their friendship wasn't yet at that stage. From Naruto's perspective, the sports day was a great success. Even though one of them punched this long-nosed guy in the stomach for calling her a pretty little kitty cat, the girls were getting along well with the police officers. Naruto pointed out that she didn't kick him in the nuts, so yes, it was. After Yamamoto objected that they weren't getting along while appearing extremely distressed, the police won the long jump and swimming competition, the firefighters won the obstacle course, and the policemen won the firefighter carry race. The score existed even prior to the day's final competition. Using a megaphone, Miwa declared, "The final competition of the day will take place after the obstacle course ribbons have been awarded." "A wheelbarrow race," she exclaimed as she spun around the stage she had ordered built for the announcement. She had appeared quite depressed that morning for some reason, but Naruto could see she was having a great time and was happy. Yamamoto looked at Naruto and made a funny choking noise. "Hi, Taiki, there are no real wheelbarrows involved in this one," Naruto explained to the man who seemed to be searching for them. Hiro-kun first made puppy eyes at Mariko-chan, and then Mariko-chan made puppy eyes at Naruto. He had planned to make the final competition something truly exciting, but he was unable to handle the puppy eyes as well as he could have. At the first sign of sad, watery eyes, his mind would always short-circuit and he would start babbling because the words weren't being properly vetted and he wasn't very tactful even in the best of circumstances. That usually made things worse rather than better. For this reason, he had promptly given up and conceded that a wheelbarrow race was a brilliant idea. "The participants act as wheelbarrows, well, half of them anyway," he said. With an unimpressed expression, Taiki questioned, "How they act like a wheelbarrow? Act as an inanimate object?" Perhaps it was against the Kiri ninja way or something to play as a kid. As the competitors arrived at the starting point, Naruto began to explain. The girls chuckled as the officers appeared extremely flushed and ashamed. This was being watched by someone through Naruto's eyes. On occasion, Kyuubi became interested in what was happening around Naruto. After the Four Tails incident, which he still didn't want to discuss because he had nearly killed Jiraiya-sensei, this had become much more apparent. Naruto sensed something turning languidly inside of Kyuubi, but there didn't seem to be much rhyme or reason for why he would watch this happen and not the other. Everything proceeded swiftly after Miwa-chan cracked the cymbals. Before taking a full 10 steps, 2 of the police teams collided, and then there was a moaning pile of 4 people, making it difficult to determine which arm and leg belonged to whom. Though not with his ears, Naruto thought he heard laughter. I guess Kyuubi likes slapstick comedy, who would have thought? He thought. On the other hand, his portfolio most likely included anything that involved even minor harm to people. "What?" Taiki asked. He had round, incredulous eyes. "Kyuubi, you know, I'm a Jinchuriki and it just thought that was funny," he said. He really didn't want to because Yamamoto would be even more terrified now, but he had learned early on that lying only made matters worse. When Iruka-sensei revealed that Akamaru had eaten his homework, he said, "If you were good, it can get you out of trouble you wouldn't have gotten in the first place if you were a little more upstanding." Since Akamaru was a real puppy and the uncrowned king of the dejected puppy look, he had been deeply offended and Naruto had apologized to him. While Yamamoto's expression remained unchanged, Taiki's was completely different. Naruto began to explain that he was sane, stable, and completely non-homicidal and honest when he asked, "You? A Jinchuriki?" Taiki then sat down on the ground, his face white, and began sputtering something about a Jinchuriki cult and him being a cult leader. With a look of relief that is universal to people who have recently discovered that they can delegate a problem to someone else to handle, Yamamoto questioned, "So you aren't a crime organization, but a cult?" Though not really, Naruto could see that he was getting what he wanted even though the fire department won the final race and the competition as a whole. Victory was supposed to taste sweet, but it actually tasted like ashes due to the fact that "Not our department as long as you don't break the laws, you can be as cultish as you want," Yamamoto stated. Naruto jumped this time when one of the in-girls said, "We are a cult. Why doesn't anyone tell me these things?" From behind them. The oldest of them was Riku, a woman who was easily over 30 years old. And incredibly strange, to all those years with the Yakuza must have contributed to it. "When is our next secret meeting? What deity are we praying to? Some sort of demon? What did Taiki-san say about you being a living saint?" She said. Naruto could see that Kyuubi was giggling uncontrollably. Going from being a Yakuza to a cultist was like tasting ashes if Iruka-sensei didn't beat her to it. Sakura-chan would kill him if he didn't eventually report this. Iso did not need this sort of reputation. Tsubaki was present when Naruto's first firefighter performed her first water jutsu. The day after the sporting event, the girls were seen proudly carrying their trophy ribbons, which were gold and white and contrasted with their practice attire, which consisted of their worst rags, which they didn't mind getting soaked, sweaty, filthy, and ripped. They walked with a bounce that Tsubaki had never noticed before, and she suddenly realized that these girl women must have gained something extremely valuable in return for winning those competitions against much larger men. Their self-respect. She concluded that this trip had already ranked among the top 3 wise choices she had ever made in her life after learning 5 new B-class and 3 A-class jutsu, teaching Idate several taijutsu lessons, and having some of the best spars of her life with Taiki. Second place in the haze of her prepubescent past, the undisputed number 1 was turning into a kunoichi. She had also assisted the girls with kunai throwing and some simple chakra molding exercises that Konatsu and Kaide didn't seem to be up to. Being able to do and teach were 2 different things, and Tsubaki wondered if she would be trusted enough to take a genin team soon after the Mizuki catastrophe. Since then, that relationship had made the worst choice of her life. Indeed, Idate had forced the students to run in the sand in order to increase their stamina and chakra stores, and the Kiri pair had done much more for the students. When one of the girls spat a water bullet out of her mouth, she was still as proud as a mother hen with her new babies. The wind was blowing from the sea in swift, erratic torrents, and the air was practically on fire with the tension of an impending storm. It was a rare gray day with damp clouds hovering low over the coast. Chakra was half spiritual energy, so perhaps it was the self-confidence boost or the damp, heavy air that gave the jutsu the final push it needed. It was there to show those who would that they had become so much more. The entire Makima would have been ablaze like a bonfire if happiness had been light. Machika was a beautiful girl to look at 17. She was practically a woman already, with large doe eyes, a sophisticated nose, and a kendo back, though it might be more accurate to refer to it as a dancer's back in her case. With her hair stuck to her skull, her face red from effort, and her brown practice rags sticking to her skin with perspiration, she still failed to look very attractive. It was a sight to behold, however, when the first bullet, a little on the small side but still incredibly cohesive and resilient, flew from her mouth for 10 meters or so before striking an old, rusted-through mooring pole and neatly snapping it in half. Her cheesy smile lit up the entire beach. "Wonderful, Machika!" exclaimed Tsubaki, cheering when the other girls joined her. Machika's redness intensified, this time from pleasure encouraged by their friend's success. The rest of them soon nearly doubled their effort. Her heart warmed at the sight of them, eyes occasionally straying from focus, tongue peeking between lips when she looked at the fruits of her labor. She was accustomed to seeing far less pleasant and significantly bloodier sights because she was a Junin. She had made up her mind. Even if it took 10 years for her to be approved, she was determined to become a teacher. She was thankful for the additional reward this trip had given her. Naruto was aware that love could manifest itself in a variety of ways. There were times when taunting someone was acceptable as long as no one else did it. Some shook their heads and questioned why Naruto was so foolish about Sasuke, even though Sasuke was his friend and occasionally a complete and utter bastard. He declared Naruto dead last, but Kiba had once done the same after they turned genin, and Sasuke had punched him for it. Apart from Iruka-sensei, Kiba's nose bled a lot because it was the first time someone had shed blood for Naruto that he had witnessed. That was the love of friends with a complete bastard. Later that day, he caused Naruto's nose to bleed as well, but it was all unrelated, so it was acceptable. Shizune loved Tsunade Bachan a lot to accompany her all those years, but sometimes love took the form of following someone when they were being foolish so that you could pick them up later when they fell. Love can sometimes mean supporting someone through their darkest moments and making everything better. Naruto learned this from Iruka, and he honored the lesson by teaching Gaara the same thing. There was some beating involved, but that was only because it was Naruto and Gaara knowing when to be tough and when to show empathy, as Kakashi-sensei did, was sometimes necessary for love, as Chuki and Ayame enjoyed feeding him. Sakura-chan also practiced her own brand of tough love. And occasionally, love took a crazy turn and insisted that starting a cult was a brilliant idea. Riku Bachan questioned him, "So you have the world's strongest demon sealed into you? And it can't get away?" "Yeah, and no way it can get away. Yondaime was the greatest seal master in the history of ever," said Naruto. He had always admired Yondaime just as much as everyone else, and even though his admiration briefly wavered when he discovered the true reason why almost everyone detested him, it was still preferable to Kyuubi destroying the entire population, right? At least they were still alive enough to despise him, and Naruto might eventually gain their respect. He was a hero, but it would be difficult. According to Iruka-sensei, he was a hero for defending everyone against Kyuubi, and his title was worth anything at all. Although Naruto never expressed it verbally or even in his own thoughts, love can occasionally manifest as unmerited forgiveness, since the reason you were despised was also the reason you received that love. These days, the safe house was more of the headquarters for Operation Whatever. In reality, Naruto simply did the right thing, and then other things happened that required him to do something. Despite everyone's apparent belief that he had some grand master plan, it was unexpected that he was alone with Riku, Miwa, and Tsubaki because the house was always so crowded. "And you want world peace?" Miwa-chan subtly inquired. She had been a little depressed lately, but since she was making fun of him, things were probably getting back to normal. Hunching his shoulders, Naruto said, "Of course, isn't that, like, a requirement for not being a dick?" Tsubaki-chan seemed to believe that if you were mature enough for Hite-ite, you were also mature enough to swear. She managed to say, "I guess, worldly world is full of dicks then." Despite her voice cracking, Naruto was positive that she was giggling uncontrollably. "I think you fulfill the minimum requirements for a saint, then. The first and last line of defense against the forces of darkness and world peace I'm joining," Riku Bachan said with a generous air. Naruto's own spit choked him. Thinking of Sakura-chan, he protested, "I'm a shinobi. Shinobi can't be saints." She was so beautiful when she was angry that Naruto found it annoying that she felt guilty. Her eyes would always sparkle like green lightning or jagged pieces of green glass. However, he was certain that he didn't want to irritate her to this degree. "Then what about Rikudo Sennin? Isn't he a saint as well as a shinobi?" He said that war does not determine who is right, only who is left, and not in the political sense, I would bet, Miwa-chan said. Naruto bit his bottom lip. He was frequently made fun of, and he was usually aware of it. Additionally, he was generally able to tell when someone was sincere, and this whole cult thing was a combination of the two. When he told them about Kyuubi and showed them the seal, they appeared genuinely impressed. Even though they were jerking his chain, he wasn't used to people being impressed by that unless they were sealing nuts or something. They had regarded him as though he had turned rocks into gold or vanquished an entire army on his own. "Well, I would rather be a cultist than a criminal," Riku Bachan stated without hesitation. "Besides, real ninja believe in world peace and eternal friendship through superior firepower, so that bit is alright, I can get behind it." Tsubaki-chan started laughing aloud instead of just inwardly. It should be mentioned that Naruto was the only way Riku had ever interacted with ninja. Perhaps she was mistaken, though, if real was a synonym for admirable. After all, optimism was good for the soul. There was a romantic triangle involving Morino Idate if his opponent hadn't been a 13-year-old boy who had a crush on his teammate, who was also 13, and had no idea Miwa-chan ever looked at him again. It wouldn't have been nearly as awkward or depressing. She had followed him around like a very well-trained dog, and if she hadn't been so obviously in love, foolish people might have had a very negative opinion of her. She kicked the leg of the counter she was seated behind and wrote on a page that had been torn out of her account book, asking, "Do you think yoga would be a good idea? Should we chant?" Although it was pretty damn funny to see Naruto turn beet red when a group of girls began chanting under his window, Idate retorted, "You realize that Naruto doesn't want a cult, right?" As she spoke to him, Miwa-chan didn't even look up, but isn't it just right that someone acknowledge the service he is doing for the world? She asked, scratching her pencil. "What do you think of these? Which one is better?" She asked, pushing the paper to Idate, who turned it around, without even donning the bura he had given her. Two were present, perhaps prayers, he thought, or a mantra. It seemed that there was a distinction between a mantra and a regular prayer, but he had no idea what it was. Even on good days, ninjas weren't particularly religious because almost all religions had rules like thou shalt not kill, and who wanted to be born as a cockroach in their next life. The only exception was Jashinism, which was reserved for complete idiots. It's best to have no faith in the entire enterprise. Additionally, he became a merchant after leaving Konoha, and they weren't exactly the most pious people ever because making money was also bad for the soul. However, it appeared that these two prayer objects were chantable. We reflect on the divine might and splendor of the one who encloses the beast in his belly, who guides our knowledge, and who defends the world against the horrible Kyuubi no Yoko. We reflect on the majesty of the one who sealed the beast in his belly, who guards the world from the horrible Kyuubi no Yoko, and who will guide us all to the light of understanding. Idate was able to say, "I think the second one is better," and Miwa-chan appeared completely serious as she took the paper back and carefully considered both options. When the shop's bell rang, Miwa-chan stood up to serve the family who had entered and slipped the paper back between the pages of the account book. With their straw hats and yukata featuring Makima sites printed on the fabric, everyone was clearly a tourist since someone by the name of Sakuya had determined that Matsuzaki-san was well enough to show his face and face the music. This was the last week they would need to staff the store at all. Idate was a little depressed because he would miss their quiet afternoons spent in the shop with Miwa-chan. Miwa-chan, who seemed to be transforming her romantic emotions into a fervent religious belief to ensure that the cult did not require celibacy, he would have to play a role in the formation of Narutoism, as it was tentatively named at the time. It was somewhat depressing to win a battle for a fair maiden's heart over a 13-year-old boy on a technicality, but he would have committed murder if he had lost because Miwa-chan had chosen to become a nun for the boy in question. 043 square. Despite the fact that everything he had done had made perfect sense, Naruto had tragically come to the conclusion that he would be held responsible for everything. "Two wrongs do make right," Shikamaru once said. It may not have been a moral statement, but it made mathematical sense. Similarly, Naruto had determined that two rights made wrong, as demonstrated by the cult ballyhoo people were engaging in. The world was devoid of justice. This was further demonstrated late at night on his 28th day in the quiet. What a joke! When there was a faint knock on the door Makimura town, Naruto woke up first and trotted barefoot to the door. While everyone else was already asleep, he opened it and rubbed his eyes drowsily. Standing on the porch with a paper doll smile was Yakushi Kabuto. He said, "Good night, Naruto-sama. I'm sorry to bother you this late, but I thought it wise to not bring my luggage through the town in broad daylight," as if his words had never been spoken. His hair gleamed like a ghost in the pale silver and white of the moon, which was half-circle overhead as his mind attempted to comprehend what his eyes, ears, and nose were telling him. Naruto simply stood motionless for a few priceless seconds. It had the gentle tones of Kabuto's voice, his scent, a hint of blood beneath, and a tang of something sharp and chemical, but Kabuto was. Before his conscious mind caught up with Naruto's hands, they were forming Rasengan, but when it did, it gave its approval. The porch was illuminated by its light, and Naruto heard multiple curses coming from inside the house. He knew that his chakra, which was tinged with Kyuubi's pain and red hatred, had now awakened the entire house. Excellent. He yelled and hit, "Who you came for now?" With uncanny grace, like quicksilver or a sliver of mist. Kabuto leapt back, and what was supposed to strike his chest instead struck the yard's dirt, creating a new crater to join the others. The lights in the town were dimmed by dust. With no alarm in his voice, Kabuto stated, "I came for you, Naruto-sama. I am the kind of person who keeps his promises, after all, and I made one for you. If anything, it was nice," as if he was discussing the weather. "Please do not try to kill me yet. I haven't been of any use to you at all. Let me talk first. You can always kill me later." For a number of reasons, that stopped Naruto in his tracks. Their faces were once more in shadows as the chakra he had collected for another Rasengan died, swaying like the light of a candle in the wind. The red haze of Kyuubi fell over his eyes, but he was still not striking. Something inside him burned and clawed, screaming that he had taken Sasuke Teme and left, that Hokage Gigi was dead, and that it was his fault. Even though everyone in the house was already running, time seemed to stretch like bubblegum. Later, you can always kill me. No, not Kabuto either. When people said such things, what was wrong with them? Apart from visiting Orochimaru, which was always a bad idea. Yakushi Kabuto, missing nin of Konoha. Tsubaki-chan's voice was as smooth as sword oil, and as she slid her blade out of its sheath, it made a faint sound even without turning. Naruto was aware that Konatsu, Kaide, and Taiki were all present and dangerous. Their intent to kill was like a weight strapped to his back. He held up his hand. Wait. The sound of Kyuubi roaring in his ears made it difficult to think, but he had to keep his head up now. Even though he was certain that Taiki was utterly mortified by the entire situation and Tsubaki-chan was amused, everyone waited simply because he told them to, suggesting that perhaps there was more to this whole cult leader thing. After all, Kabuto gave him a joyful smile, but that smile wasn't the same as true happiness. Nato was somewhat hurt, but he lacked the words to express it still, though. He said, "You took Sasuke. In any event, Kabuto had assisted with it, made the entire thing possible." Kabuto said, "I have brought him back to you," and pointed to the center of the yard with his hand like one shadow among many. There was the outline of a barrel. It had something draped about it, like temple charms. He didn't come peacefully. Naruto chuckled. The idea of Sasuke's furious face when he was forced into the barrel against his will made Naruto burst into a fit of giggles. Even though it was a foolish move and nothing was right and perhaps everything would work out in the end, fairness and equality were required. Although he had assisted in Sasuke's removal, Kabuto had returned him. Orochimaru was the one who had killed Hokage Gigi, but he was now dead. He said, "Will you help me kill Orochimaru?" He had been friends with Kabuto. It's true that he had harmed Naruto, but if he began to turn against people, well, he desired Kabuto's return just and equal. "Let's talk." 6 ninja were seated around a table in the living room, and a barrel stood in the center. Kabuto found the tea to be sufficiently bitter and hot without the aid of jutsu. Ono Tsubaki, the traitor Mizuki's former lover, if Kabuto recalled correctly, was glaring at him with the intensity of a fire. But she continued to stare at the barrel. The 2 Kiri kids didn't seem to understand what this was about, but Doihara Taiki did. However, Kabuto was only attracted to one person. Naruto-sama questioned him, "Is this one of those, you didn't ask, things?" "Yes," Kabuto said without shame. Taking a sip of his tea, he didn't blame Ono and Doihara for it being drug-free. His arrival was sure to be unexpected. They were usually smarter, he was certain. Kabuto blinked, caught off guard, as Naruto-sama asked, "What you meant? I can kill you later. You don't want to die, do you? Why you say such things?" This was not the reason he had anticipated being asked. Why would he pass away so quickly? Why not? With his own questions, he answered, "What is the point of living if I'm no one? If you don't want me, who I am?" His pulse had increased without his consent. Ordinarily, he had more control over his body thanks to his medical techniques, but now he felt it slowly vanishing beneath the wary, irate blue eyes. Even though he couldn't recall a time when he had been afraid of dying, he could vaguely recall this feeling when he was a child. Nono had taken care of him and promised him candy if he performed well on an exam. Although he didn't receive the highest grades, not even the 3rd best, he had passed. Now that everything had come full circle, he was weighing anxiously once more, but the stakes were far higher than a piece of candy. Was Naruto-sama satisfied with 4th best? He didn't want to be disowned, but he would die if it came to that. "You are Kabuto. You are good at keeping secrets and too literal and kind of an idiot and a total jerk, but don't worry, it's not like I'm not used to that." Acceptance, acknowledgement, invitation. After getting up, Naruto-sama went to the barrel where his teammate was sleeping. His face wavered like a mirage. While some people used porcelain masks to hide their emotions, Naruto displayed too much for interpretation. Overwhelming senses rather than suppressing them, a jumble of contradictions, a bit of melancholy, and a great deal of resolve. Naruto-sama demanded, turning around with lightning-fast eyes, just like his teammates. "Okay. So we wake Sasuke up tomorrow and ride to Tsunade Bachan. We have him and you are going to tell everything you know about Orochimaru, but first tell me what the hell messed you up like that. It isn't that hard to answer, right?" Naruto-sama twitched, almost jumped, as Ono gently reprimanded him. "Naruto-kun, who can trust the color of a chameleon? This isn't sensible. We must detain him." A kunai could have broken the 3 Kiri ninjas' silence, which was already oppressive due to the night and even more so due to the barrel's silence. Though he had learned to identify emotions, Kabuto didn't fully comprehend them, and that barrel was full of maybes and what-ifs. Naruto-sama whispered, "The ninja lizard, your colors," as his hand lingered over Kabuto's. Although it wasn't his place, Kabuto couldn't ask Naruto-sama to touch him even though he wanted to. He was created, broken, and remade by the circle, which would never stop spinning. He had to respond to Naruto-sama. He replied to both of them, "Shimura Danzo is the one who did this to me. You can bind me and seal my chakra if you wish." Ono's hands turned into fists and she went pale, but Naruto-sama's face only showed unmistakable, unconflicted rage. His hand came into contact with it. The body of the material world is where the energy flow starts if permitted. It freely circulates throughout the body and occasionally manifests itself outside of the five senses. The human is a moon that reflects the divine sun, a clear mirror that is imperfect, flipped, and flawed. Divine ecstasy can be experienced when one learns to elevate bodily sensations to the sixth sense. The sun had just started to peek over the horizon when Sai strolled down the street. When other senses didn't need to be extended to prevent collisions with other people, it was simple to read a book while strolling so early. He had picked a book to teach him how to behave like a human, but he wasn't entirely sure about it. On the one hand, he frequently felt like a mirror, or a moon if one wanted to employ lofty, nostalgic metaphors, simply reflecting what he witnessed in other people. However, he had never considered that attaining an orgasm was so important for maintaining mental equilibrium. That is, if soul and spiritual balance were thought to be the same as mental balance, there were no precise descriptions in the book, but it seemed to be a slightly different thing. An infiltrator could still benefit from becoming a moon or mirror, and although his youth and undeveloped body prevented him from using the methods outlined, he made an effort to live up to the ideal instead of reflecting who he truly was. It reflected his targets and what they desired to see in others. The moon's shape was best identified as a crescent or sliver, rather than in its entirety or even in half. If he only fully assimilated the concept, his incomplete self would undoubtedly be acknowledged as a true human as well. His good intentions were all for nothing. There was a loud crash coming from the safe house as he reached the door. He broke in to find a chaotic scene because he thought Uzumaki was being attacked. As the Jinchuriki kneeled on his chest and pinned his arms to the ground, the missing nin Uchiha Sasuke lay on the ground. Growling at him, a long-nosed man in blue clothing, who was clearly armed, stood behind a table that had been kicked around and broken in half like a barrel. Junin Ono sat against a wall, her hand on the handle of her sword, her hard, piercing eyes turned to Sai. Above this entire scene stood Danzo-sama, Orochimaru's servant, and Yakushi Kabuto, a traitor to the root. Sai immediately attacked Yakushi because the Uchiha was under control and posed a lesser threat anyhow. After the Uchiha massacre, Uchiha Sasuke had become quite famous. At first glance, it appeared that the last Uchiha was the star student of Hitaki Kakashi, and the academy's most anticipated star Naruto simply kept catching up to him, inch by agonizing inch, even though he couldn't complain about the amount of time the man spent teaching him. After that, there was Gaara. That night, that awful night when the brother he had always adored and admired stood over his parents' still warm bodies, his swords red and wet, dripping on the floorboards like a rain cloud, was the last time Sasuke had felt so terrified. In his memories, his mother sang, "It's raining, it's pouring." Despite her quiet demeanor, it's the elderly man snoring. When Gaara made him feel so powerless again, he would never be able to forgive her. In his dreams, he occasionally heard his mother singing, but she was so far away that he couldn't tell the difference between the red moon and the red sand. After bumping his head in bed, he was unable to wake up the next morning. Such depressing tunes, taken down by their own, for the once powerful Uchiha. In actuality, Sasuke was a big fish in a small pond because he was a star student at the academy. Being thrust into the larger pond of Konohagakure no Sato was a shock to his system from which he never fully recovered. Since he couldn't bear the idea that he might be flawed, Konoha must have done something wrong to weaken him in a strange way. The choice to kill his heart had worked. He had vowed to leave that clumsy self behind him along with the rest of Konoha, and he had moved his team photo from one shelf to another, the one where he kept the photos of his deceased. He was willing to pay the price. It would be an understatement to say that he was not happy to learn that his old teammate had successfully spread the friendship nonsense to one of his new teachers. He was actually furious beyond measure, and it didn't help that he was once more forced into a barrel against his will. He was only dimly aware that the barrel was moving, and he was more asleep than awake inside when the lid was eventually forced open and powerful arms pulled him out and placed him in a basket hold. The grogginess remained. Everything was blurry in his watering eyes, and the sudden light stung. He had ringing in his ears. He had no power. Or was it an embrace? And beneath the floppy, glaringly yellow hair, he thought he might have seen a hint of those birthmarks. Sasuke. You are back, Naruto. I will kill you. Sasuke swore at Yakushi, that traitor, as he fought against his captor's grip. It was clear that Yakushi was proud of himself, but he always was that arrogant snake. He growled at Naruto and twisted to free one hand, but the orange-clad fool's arms were like steel bands. "I'm not going to let you hold me back," he said. "Konoha only made me weak, like you gods, it's contagious." He heard someone laughing in the background, which intensified the sound in his mind like a brand just removed from a fire. His curse mark was blazing. "Now you're just being stupid." Orochimaru became strong in Konoha. Kabuto became strong in Konoha. Your brother became strong in Konoha. Just stop being stupid and come back home. It's not like you're really a missing nin or anything. Naruto continued. Sasuke quickly picked up on that final detail, demonstrating Naruto's lack of knowledge, and because of that one obvious lie, it was simple to overlook the fact that Itachi and Orochimaru were both Konoha born and Konoha trained. He reminded his old teammate, "What you mean? I'm not really a missing nin. I tried to kill you, remember? By what Kakashi-sensei said, that would make me lower than trash." After he eventually succeeded in getting his arm to break the basket hold, the maneuver was unnecessary because, of course, that stupid Naruto had to thrust him arm's length away, ruining all of his hard work. Was he not even capable of holding someone captive? Stop being so hard on yourself. Self-esteem is for everyone, you know? And I'm totally over that almost killing thing, so don't worry, Naruto said with a smile. What do you mean, over it? You can't just be over it. Had Sasuke nearly killed someone who was, in a way, his friend, that had been one of his darkest moments. The entire situation was a double failure because he hadn't even succeeded in the end, and if he wasn't over it, Naruto couldn't be. Damn it, and there is nothing wrong with my self-esteem. Naruto made the amusing observation, "You just called yourself trash." An unidentified girl behind his back put her hand over her mouth, but not fast enough to conceal a smile when a boy beside her bit the ball of his thumb. Sasuke's already strained temper erupted. Naruto jumped back and pushed him flat on his back as fast as a snake. Much faster than he used to be, after he threw the annoyance against the table, which broke with a satisfying crash. He yelled at the top of his lungs, "I didn't say it, Kakashi said it," while Naruto simply had an angry, confused, and anxious expression. The unidentified boy was now hanging from the girl's shoulder, his entire upper body trembling with silent laughter as Naruto said, Yes you did, and Kakashi-sensei isn't even here. Did you hit your head when Kabuto stashed you in there?" Sasuke gave a silent snarl. At this point, a boy in Konoha's Idate burst onto the scene and made an immediate attempt to murder Yakushi. Naruto believed that this was the greatest day ever when he snapped, snarling Sasuke to the ground. Perhaps Sasuke Teme wasn't entirely on board with the idea yet, but Naruto was certain he could convince him to change his mind. Especially since he had successfully reunited two of his closest friends. He was positive that the biggest mistake he and Sakura-chan had made in the first round was not getting enough edgewise words in fast enough. This was the happiest day of his life, and he was a little worried that his heart would burst like a tag, leaving bits of Naruto scattered everywhere. Then Kabuto was attacked by an odd Konoha shinobi who had interrupted his party. Naruto was momentarily conflicted as he sat on top of Sasuke, afraid that the jerk would simply flee once more, fearing that Kabuto would be harmed in preparation for flashing through the hand signs of this or that jutsu. Tsubaki-chan stood as if she had been turned to stone, and Taiki, Konatsu-chan, and Kaide all moved, touched the handle of a sword or a kunai, or pressed their fingers together, but nobody took any action. Only Kabuto, who moved so fast, could see a blur, and the stranger's basic fire jutsu struck the wall instead. He yelled, "Someone put the fire out." Konatsu-chan spun around and spat the water bullet with the dexterity of someone who has practiced the jutsu countless times over the past few days. In the span of a few heartbeats, the floor flooded. Naruto was largely sheltered by his perch atop Sasuke, but his duck butt was beginning to resemble a wet puppy instead. "Let me up." Sasuke pushed at his chest and gave him the order. Moving him wasn't difficult enough, but perhaps it was a little cruel to force Sasuke to lie in what was essentially a puddle. "No." Kabuto dodged another blow and said, "What should I do with him, Naruto-sama?" There was another blur, but this time it ended with a meaty thump and a pained groan, followed by a splash when the pale boy hit the floor, but he immediately got up. The words caused the shinobi to glance at Naruto sharply before leaping towards him. Tsubaki-chan spoke quickly and stepped half a step closer to the boy, making a gesture with her hands that seemed to appease him. "Please, Shinobi-san. This isn't what it looks like. Yakushi Kabuto has defected from Orochimaru and offered us the Uchiha and information," she said as his gaze shifted from Tsubaki-chan to Kabuto, then to Naruto and Sasuke, and finally to the others. The boy merely scowled. Nobody attacked him. Instead, they just stared at him, which caused Naruto to wince a little in sympathy. It must have been awkward. He said flatly, "Oh no." Tsubaki, suspected of working for Orochimaru, and took out a sketchbook and an ink-dripping brush from his bag. Naruto would have considered that completely innocuous only a few months ago, but these months spent with Jiraiya had shown him the potential uses for seals. He shouted to Kabuto, "Just don't kill him, or terribly maim him." He added that last part because he thought Kabuto might need it. Then everything happened in a flash. All the stads jumped out of the way, allowing the oncoming battle plenty of space, now drawing their blades too, but not attacking. And Sasuke slammed into him like a snake, sending him tumbling to the ground. While he was looking at Sasuke Teme and getting back up on his feet, he was unable to see the black object that emerged from the sketchbook out of the corner of his eye. Kaide used taijutsu to attack Sasuke, who was now closest to him. Sasuke was able to block with ease, but Naruto was already approaching. Like some repulsive skin condition, the curse marks rose up Sasuke's cheek and neck. Even with Kyuubi's assistance, Naruto was certain that Sasuke's blow to his sternum would break something and cause excruciating pain. He jumped and blocked because it was only cool to break ribs and puncture the heart or lungs when you were the one doing it. He didn't believe anything had broken, but the pain went up his arm and he felt numb at its heels then, muttering, "Sloppy," to himself as he sidestepped Kaide and kicked the boy. He delivered a punch that Sasuke didn't even bother to block. The kick failed to make contact. Naruto almost jumped out of his skin when Kabuto appeared so fast. One tap was sufficient, even though it was less intense than the Hyuga Tenketsu blows, and Kabuto's hand glowed a sickly green. Naruto saw that Kabuto was effortlessly carrying the stranger over his shoulder as Sasuke fell to the ground like a rag doll. He saw that the boy resembled Sasuke a lot now that he could look closely. Kaide appeared to want to accuse Kabuto of nearly giving him a heart attack as he leaned against the wall and clutched his chest over his heart. Overall, it was a bad day for heart health. He put the stranger down and said, "The situation is under control. Naruto-sama, I believe we should restrain at least one of them before they wake up to avoid a repetition of this." So they did. Since Sasuke was the one who had previously escaped, Naruto felt a little bad about tying him up, but precedent and all. "Were you attempting to engage in a tantric sex ritual with Uchiha earlier?" was the first thing the Sasuke lookalike said upon waking up. This was the first time Naruto and Sasuke had shown a united purpose in 4 months. Both of them attempted to strangle Uchiha. Given that Sasuke's hands had been bound behind him rather than in front, Naruto thought Sasuke's attempt was excellent as Taiki withdrew them. That kind of legwork wasn't even present in Lee. Only a diamond could scratch another diamond, making them the hardest material known to man. However, diamonds originated from carbon, a soft, easily burned coal that is useful in its own right but far less so than diamonds. When carbon was heated and subjected to extreme pressure in the Earth's core, it burned to produce diamonds, which are durable and brilliant. Shinobi, like coal, could only be fully realized in the most extreme circumstances. Sai was one of the fortunate few. Sai's world darkened when he saw the green glow of a chakra-made scalpel. When he realized he had woken up, he was shocked because he knew enough about chakra scalpels. The house still looked a little run down and charred around the edges, but someone had carried the tatami mats outside and done their best to dry the wooden floor. The fact that he was unbound and that the Uchiha, who was staring at him from a wooden crate that had taken the place of the broken table, had his hands bound startled him even more. However, Kabuto was unencumbered and positioned himself beside Uzumaki, while Ono stood behind him, her hand resting on the handle of her sword. Conflicting signals plagued Sai, which was never good when you were carrying knives the size of a small armory. "Were you attempting to engage in a tantric sex ritual with Uchiha earlier?" Uzumaki responded with his fingers outstretched like claws. Uzumaki leapt at Sai as his face flushed. Even after Uzumaki was grabbed by the back of his jumpsuit by an unidentified, long-nosed man dressed in blue, the Uchiha kicked him in the chest and tried to choke Sai with his legs. A kick to the larynx would have been a far more effective way to kill him, but it wasn't a bad attempt. Really, Orochimaru's training had clearly been inadequate thus far. An unidentified girl sputtered, "It seems you are the one he spread his legs for," and Uchiha turned to face her. While in the man's grasp, his entire body language conveyed barely contained aggression, which Sai ascribed to the negative impact of the curse seal. However, Uzumaki seemed to have forgotten his outburst of unreasonable anger, perhaps brought on by Kyuubi, and gave the girl a snort. Uzumaki introduced himself and held out his hand. "So I'm Uzumaki Naruto, though I'm called Sato Naruto here, so you better use that name too," he said. "These are Tsubaki-chan, she's my backup here and a really cool and strong Junin. Konatsu-chan and Kaide, they ran away from Kiri when their jerk-ass teachers told them to kill each other to graduate. They are a sister and a brother. You know he's Taiki, he came after them, but we made him see the light so he stayed as well. And Kabuto used to be my friend and he came back to join my cult that I didn't ask for and didn't try to found, and Sasuke's still being stupid about things so he gets to be tied up." Uzumaki pointed at each and every person as he introduced them and thrust his hand out again. Sai gazed up at it, then up at Uzumaki's face. Uzumaki said, "You are supposed to take it." In an oddly lilting rhythm, Uzumaki shook their intertwined hands up and down several times as Sai followed instructions. "Now you are supposed to tell me your name," the Jinchuriki said as he went on to lecture. Since Uzumaki appeared willing to explain the social norm he was adhering to, he inquired, "My name is Sai. Are these manners common amongst people or only those who belong in cults?" Really, it was very helpful of him. Exasperated, Ono questioned, "Are we sure this cult is a good idea on top of everything else?" Now that Yakushi was moving a few paces to the side, away from Uzumaki but simultaneously towards Sai, she was leaning against the wall with one hand, and he found himself reconsidering his first impressions of her allegiances. Did she stay loyal to Konoha if she acted aggressively toward Orochimaru's subordinates and protectively toward Uzumaki? Or the cult that hasn't been named yet? Or rather, to Uzumaki herself, since she didn't appear to think highly of said cult? If Ono proved to be a threat, he had been ordered to kill her, but the evidence was contradicting itself. Thus far, to make a decision, he required additional information. It was also planned to kill Yakushi. Kabuto Sai was acutely aware after their brief battle, which he had only survived on Uzumaki's orders, that he was no match for the former Ado Nin. However, he knew far too much to be permitted to live. However, there were multiple strategies for defeating an adversary. "What is this cult? May I join it too?" asked the man after reading a piece on cult psychology. He was pretty sure that if he could win these people over as his own, they wouldn't expect to be betrayed. He had no issue with being cut off from civilian society and was willing to comply with Uzumaki's manipulation for the time being. In addition, physical hardship was one of the main requirements that had to be met when initiation into a cult. This could include chronic hunger, lack of sleep, long manual labor, or other similar conditions. Sai reasoned that a fight should be enough. Clearly, he was ideal cult material. "I have seen eyes like yours before, Sai." Yakushi drew lead. "Oh, maybe you will." Sai gazed into the dark eyes of the man, then he was unable to turn away. He had once read that eyes were like the cool surface of water underground, and that trying to find the difference between a lover and an enemy there was romantic folly. He was aware that the muscles surrounding the eyes and eyebrows actually created the facial expressions that were ascribed to the eyes. This he had read. Kabuto's dark eyes appeared to hold a gravity seal that limited Sai's perception to those eyes and nothing else. "I have seen eyes like yours before, Sai. Too often in the mirror. Did you have a name before Danzo sent you here, or did you merely have a number? Who had to die so you had no one to define yourself by? Nothing left but memories, a little less bitter every year." He began, "Don't," but then realized he didn't know what he was asking Yakushi to refrain from. He was positive that the Jinchuriki would not permit him to be tortured if Roots files of Uzumaki Naruto were even slightly accurate. "May I be alone with him for a little while, Naruto-sama? We could share our experiences and life lessons under Danzo." Yakushi replied. All Sai could see were his eyes. Sai had been meticulously trained to be fearless, but now he questioned whether the slight niggling in the back of his mind was an indication of fear. Sai believed that there might be a diamond here that was harder than he was, but only a diamond could scratch another diamond. It was weird to see Sasuke again after all these months, and Naruto wasn't sure how to react. Indeed, there was some anger. In fact, there was a great deal of it. Why had that fool abandoned him and Sakura-chan and fled to the snake freak, causing Sakura-chan to cry? He could see that Sasuke had wanted to be strong in order to defeat Itachi and all, but a curse seal that twisted your body until a creepy missing nin could possess you was not the source of true strength. So, goodbye to your revenge. Knowing that your friends supported you and were willing to fight for you to achieve your objectives, even if those objectives were to stop a murderous maniac from going missing, was what truly gave you strength. Sasuke should have received this at the very least, even if he was a total moron. Thus, Naruto was indeed enraged. Sakura-chan was in tears. He was elated with relief, though even with Orochimaru's new, stylish body, Sasuke remained Sasuke and was still in control of his own body. His hair was a little longer, as if he hadn't bothered to cut it, his sleeves were a little too short, as if he hadn't bothered to get larger clothes, and Sasuke was paler now, as if he hadn't seen the sun in a long time. Naruto was somewhat taken aback that his pursuit of vengeance hadn't caused him to neglect taking a bath. Well, that may have been a slight exaggeration, but Sasuke ought to have looked after himself. He was still only Sasuke, though. He questioned his misbehaving teammate. "Can I trust you to not run, or do I have to keep you tied up?" He didn't want to bother them in that way, but he was fairly certain that Taiki and Kabuto could capture Sasuke before he left Makimura's borders. Anyhow, he was against Sasuke running. In addition, he had to be concerned about Orochimaru, Sai, Danzo, and Kabuto. After all of this chaos, at least becoming Hokage should be easy. Did he have to handle everything because he was the only person on the continent with a complete brain? Sasuke grumbled in a somber tone, "I can't get strong enough to beat Itachi in Konoha." As he fought against his ropes, Naruto was fairly certain that Sasuke was being petty and that he knew it was pointless as well. He therefore had a fool and a clue club to use to strike the fool in the head. At least he was skilled at hitting things. "Look, you idiot, Itachi became strong enough to kill your clan in Konoha. Orochimaru became strong in Konoha and so did Kabuto. Okay, Bad example since I'm gonna give that Danzo bastard his just desserts, and how did that happen? Danzo had cost Naruto some faith in his fellow humans, even though he was aware that the world was full of evil people and that they weren't always on the opposing side. He was going to get his money back because he had cost Kabuto and, it seems, sigh a lot more. The legendary Uzumaki Naruto was on you, Danzo, so just wait. I've been in Konoha this whole time. Do you think I'm weak? He yelled. Well, technically he hadn't been in Konoha, but it still counted because he had been a Konoha nin the entire time. Sasuke snarled at him. I'm not an idiot, you moron, as his Sharingan whirled in a difficult-to-follow jumble of red and black. A month ago, Naruto would have yelled in rage at this statement, but now he simply snorted and shook his head. You've been cheating this whole time. I know about Kyuubi. He was aware that he was now superior to that. Hey, Avenger-chan, which one of us agreed to be turned into a monster? And if you think Kyuubi helped any, have you seen my academy grades? He inquired and took a deep breath. Though he knew it wouldn't help, he kind of wanted to get angry. Look, I'm going to go back to Konoha to ambush Danzo before he can figure out Kabuto's with us again, and Sai's gonna be too, and after that we'll go after Orochimaru before he figures it out. If you can live through that, you are going to be one kick-ass shinobi, and I bet they have a lot of cool jutsu scrolls too, and if Kabuto taught you in Auto, he can teach you in Konoha too. He told Sasuke he didn't have to say that, did he? He was not going to allow Sasuke Teme to die in terms of bribery. It was fairly obvious, but since the hammer hadn't worked, why not try the club? The Sharingan also began to swirl more slowly. The win goes to Clue Club. Tsubaki had conducted a thorough interview with Yakushi Kabuto, and because Naruto had ordered her to be honest, she felt she had gotten honest responses, which were undoubtedly unsettling enough. She didn't think the man should be able to function at all if they were really hiding something more unsettling. Her words were, my professional opinion, it's time to call a spade what it is. You are nuttier than a squirrel in a bag of crackers. I don't think I have ever heard that before, Kabuto remarked with a laugh. Usually people just scream, you were insane, or, you were crazy. Never for very long, though. Tsubaki gritted her teeth at his extremely non-confrontational, matter-of-fact tone. In the safe house, they were kneeling on either side of the table, with 2 cups and a pot of tea between them. She could see through the window to the garden where Miwa was hanging the laundry to dry, and Konatsu had left fluffy blue slippers by the door. The house was still a little bare, but the new residents had left their marks. Naruto had placed potted plants there, and Tsubaki had made new curtains that were yellow and, more importantly, mesh enforced. It had been a little awkward to explain to the weaver that yes, she wanted this roll of wire mesh sewed between 2 layers of fabric, but the security they provided had made the situation worthwhile. They needed to paper over the charring Sai had decided to add to the walls, but that wasn't the point. It was a vibrant place, and against this tapestry, Kabuto's pale, white hair appeared even more lifeless and ghostly. He wasn't trying to look lively himself. At least Tsubaki remembered the smile he once had. Perhaps, just possibly, this was a sign that the situation wasn't going to blow up in their faces. It wasn't that he didn't believe Naruto-kun could change someone's perspective on the world and reality. He practically questioned reality every week, or perhaps these had just been particularly hectic weeks, and yelled from the rooftops that no matter how much reality tried to break him, he wasn't going to be the one to leave broken. Tsubaki agreed to the crazy plan after he made the moral decision to purge the town where he was to hide from the Yakuza. It had been so simple that she felt a little ashamed. He believed that prostitution was easily fixable and that people only liked to make things more difficult than they actually were. He also believed that it was not a complicated social or socioeconomic issue that would simply have to be tolerated. Or 2 Kiri missing nin requesting refuge? Alright. Let's also convert the 100 nin at this point. Tsubaki truly had a lot of faith in Taiki. Perhaps she needed a mental health checkup, but she did. Even Sasuke's sort of under duress reformation was something she could reluctantly accept in the future, but Kabuto? Although she didn't know him well, he had been there on the edge of her consciousness, the eternal genin who was unable to advance, until he was revealed to be Junin level and employed by a man who was listed as one of the top 5 most dangerous traitors in history by the Leaf, order of entry uncertain. Her opinion had been formed by those answers, which she hoped were honest. Kabuto was brilliant, but it was like the brilliance of a broken crystal. Even though the prisms were clearly broken and only a fool would grab one without thick gloves, they still produced rainbows in the sun. Kabuto made a snake-like motion with his head, his eyes scanning her body in a non-salacious but evaluative manner. I don't trust you. I'm keeping an eye on you, and if you so much as twitch in a suspicious way before we can get you to the Hokage's office, or after, your head will part company from the rest of you. She wasn't totally sure she could fulfill that threat, to be honest, but she was also Junin, and with Taiki at her side, they should be able to handle it. There was the slightest twitch at the left corner of Kabuto's mouth, but his voice remained pleasantly unremarkable, as if they were discussing the weather or some other equally trivial subject. Letting me know you don't trust me wasn't a very good move, you know, in the completely hypothetical possibility that I'm playing you. Now it was official, this was fun for the bastard. With a sigh, Tsubaki picked up a brown paper bag from the floor and glared at the silver-haired man. It isn't as though I could make you believe in my sudden faith in your sudden loyalty, so let me make my point in peace, okay? She said true, it was an uncomfortable situation, but for the time being, she would have to accept it. She shoved the paper bag into Kabuto's arms and watched him carefully inspect it for hidden seals before carefully opening it. Here, take these, it's a tradition now, and let's call a spade a spade. You are here and I can't be rid of you, so welcome to the group. It was probably the first unplanned expression she had gotten out of him, the one he made when he saw what was inside. He raised one sardonic eyebrow in response to the question, pumpkin bread? But it was insufficient to conceal the startled curve of his eyes. She didn't trust him, but she was prepared to give Naruto his one chance to win him over. Konatsu got a bit carried away, but you aren't getting the bombs, don't even bother asking. Who knew? One chance to capture a larger monster. Perhaps two. Back at the academy, Taiki's first teacher had once told him that water never ran out. If you boil it, it will eventually return to the earth. If you freeze it, it will eventually melt. If you pour it on the ground, the plants will raise it back into the atmosphere. Being a water ninja meant being flexible, adaptive, and always evolving like his entire village. He had long since forgotten this. If more people had paid attention to Yamadera-sensei, perhaps Kiri would be a better place. Irony did not escape him that a fire shinobi was giving him a crash course in adaptability. With some difficulty, he said, "You are just going to go to your Hokage with them in tow? Without even writing to her first?" His eyes shifted from Sai, who was looking at Kabuto with a mixture of curiosity and mild horror, to Kabuto, who was eating pumpkin bread and grinning as if nothing were wrong, to Sasuke, who was glaring at Naruto while he was untied and not attempting to flee. Of course, if I gave her advanced warning, that Danzo bastard would get warned as well. Don't worry, Tsunade Bachan is gonna do the right thing. She ran away from Konoha and gambled and drank all over the continent because she hated Konoha getting people killed. How you think she's going to take the news about Danzo? Naruto responded and happily ate his ramen. Konatsu raised one eyebrow and said, "You call her Bachan behind her back?" With a sardonic lilt. "Are you sure she will want to help you?" "I call her Bachan to her face. Don't you know how old she is?" replied Naruto as they pictured what would happen in Kiri if anyone were to call the Mizukage names. The three former Kiri nin choked in their own saliva. Perhaps the crazy plan of ambushing the Hokage with this problem would succeed if Naruto could actually get away with it, and he was the most honest person Taiki had ever encountered. With her chopsticks clutching a handful of leeks as if they were a barrier between her and the insane world, Tsubaki's hand had frozen in midair the phrases, "technically true, kind of," and "what happened to the world I used to live in anyway?" were caught in her muttering, and Taiki completely agreed with her. Miwa wrung her hem in her hands and asked, "Are you going to return here?" As usual, she was seated beside Naruto, with a pencil and an abandoned pad on the crate table in front of her. She stared at the boy beneath her lashes with almost feverish eyes. "Sure, I have responsibilities here, and besides, Ero-sensei would have an apoplexy if he came here and I was missing," Naruto said cheerfully. Miwa instantly brightened, but Taiki, who was no longer particularly surprised, opened his mouth again after recalling a certain enormous toad that was brandishing a sword. "You call Jiraiya of the Sannin Ero-sensei behind his back?" asked he thought. "Irreverence. Your name is Naruto or Uzumaki, perhaps." He had heard tales of the clan before Uzushiogakure was destroyed. Naruto joyfully destroyed yet another fragment of reality, saying, "I call him Ero-sensei to his face. You know he writes the Icha Icha, right?" Taiki wondered if he was going into some kind of disbelieving catatonia because he was no longer able to open his jaw. There were rumors that it was Jiraiya, but there were always rumors the name Jiraiya was on the covers. He didn't truly believe it, believing it to be propaganda from Konoha's adversaries, as how could the legendary? "I was his proofreader for a while, and let me tell you, those books aren't all that great," Naruto told them. Since Konatsu and Kaide were dead and not in need of shelter, it was decided that they would stay in Makima and continue training the fire department with Idate's help until Taiki's brain could process new information once more. Miwa had pledged to take charge of repairing the safe house and creating additional mantras. Naruto had attempted to disassociate himself from his position as cult leader by pointing out that Shodem Hokage had battled Kyuubi first, but this had only served to bolster the girl's confidence because he now had to be added to the saints as well for good measure. Rakudo Sennin was also mentioned because what legitimate Jinchuriki cult would have overlooked him. Flexibility, flexibility, flexibility. Hell, he wouldn't have been shocked if Naruto's affinity turned out to be water at this point. He looked at the boy evaluatingly and said, "Do you know what your elemental affinity is?" Fire was the most prevalent element in Fire Country, which is why the elemental country got its name. However, there were some exceptions, most notably their first Hokage, who had been both earth and water. Naruto said with joy, "It's wind," and Taiki couldn't help but chuckle, contrary to the very end, of course. It wasn't until the last few hours before dawn that the town of Makima truly experienced darkness. The lights of the eateries and bars where the tourists partied long after midnight were still shining on the promenade, and the night was filled with music and laughter. No one noticed the shadow darting swiftly from rooftop to rooftop as couples strolled the streets on their way back to their hotel or from one amusement to another on the night of Makima. Yakushi Kabuto had walked away from his minder. Since it wouldn't do for the Uchiha to change their minds and try a last-minute escape, he was checking on Sasuke on the final night before the group would depart for Konoha. To be honest, he was relieved they were going. The head innkeepers and the casino boat manager, the anxious proprietor of the delicacy shop that had initially provided Naruto-sama with cover, the starry-eyed assistant and her incessant demands that he approve some of her writings, and the fire department leadership, who were so fixated on seizing control of the kitchen and creating explosives concealed in fruits that the clone jutsu was actually required, were all in Makima. In addition to managing Sasuke and Sai under the watchful eyes of Taiki and Tsubaki, he hardly had time for Kabuto on the way to Konoha. They wouldn't be alone, but 4 people was preferable to nearly 20 every day. The old-fashioned safe house had a single large room that Naruto-sama and his minions used as a living space, dining room, and bedroom. Even before Kabuto, his gift, and the root shinobi arrived, it had clearly been a little tight, but it was just not realistic to expect 8 people, 3 of whom were under suspicion and guard, to share a room. There had been disputes over where to put the 3 visitors after Naruto-sama had taken Matsuzaki's storehouse for temporary housing. The issue of allocating the ninja to protect the 3 remained after Tsubaki insisted that Kabuto and Sasuke be kept apart to prevent them from plotting together. This was a reasonable precaution in and of itself. The woman had been greatly irritated by the fact that Tsubaki and Taiki, the most competent of Naruto-sama's underlings, aside from Kabuto, were unable to share a guard. Tsubaki ultimately made the decision to keep an eye on Kabuto in the safe house's storage room while Taiki took care of Sasuke and Sai there. Since Konoha was the only village with a large enough population to assign Junin, Kabuto was happy that Naruto-sama had been given one as a backup in a quiet area like Makima. Even though it worked for him now, he was less pleased that using genjutsu to trick the woman had been so simple. Taiki was more difficult. The man was a former Anbu member from a subdivision that dealt with some of the most destitute individuals in the 5 countries, whereas Tsubaki had been a good Junin who was good at everything but nothing exceptional. Instead of using genjutsu, he used a jutsu from the Yamanaka family, which caused the man to go from light sleep to deep unconsciousness. Between a few crates was a little cot in the room reserved for Sasuke. Kabuto was completely unsurprised to discover that the boy was moving like an animal in a cage in a circle across the tiny floor area. Sai was also awake on the other side of a higher wall of crates, but Kabuto didn't mind the other person listening, and Sasuke's privacy was not the reason he had come. He said, laughing, "That is not a good idea," as the Uchiha turned abruptly around, his face flushed in the faint light that came in through a tiny window close to the ceiling. If Sasuke couldn't even control his own reactions, he still had a long way to go before he could match his brother. Kabuto was aware of how this conversation would proceed and that Sasuke would probably suffer some psychological harm because there were some things the youngster wasn't yet ready to face. However, Kabuto was okay with that as long as he didn't depart without Naruto-sama's consent. With a spat, Sasuke asked, "How he is so strong? I can understand the cult. They're just weak civilians. I can understand the 2 from Mist. They never even made proper genin. But Taiki, what Naruto did to get you? Do you know what the will of fire is? Outsiders take it for Konoha mysticism, philosophy, and Konoha lets them think what they will. In truth, it is a chakra control technique, not one I have ever managed. I'm much too fragmented, and this technique requires the user is sane." He knew that he had Sasuke's complete focus. The boy bore the obvious handprint of the council outside the village's boundaries. One so easily exploitable should never have been permitted. However, Danzo liked them broken and easily owned. If that had been Kabuto's only option, he would have at least chosen to bandage him rather than further break him one day. That might even help him. Chakra is half mental energy. The will of fire is to make your goal, your dream, or your mission, into an inseparable part of yourself. To eat it and drink it, to breathe it, to make it your cloak and bed, and to make it your blade. and remain a whole person. It is a delicate balance to find, one which requires a great deal of maybe idealism is a wrong word. The person has to be wholesome enough that their goal doesn't destroy them, of course. There were other focusing techniques that didn't have such harsh requirements, but Kabuto wasn't there for Sasuke. He made no reference to them. How come killing Itachi isn't wholesome enough? He is a traitor, a kinslayer. He's still a threat to everybody. Sasuke yelled, such an unruly boy. Really, Sai couldn't possibly be asleep now, even if he had been earlier. You wanted to stop hurting, you didn't care about the threat he is. There is nothing wrong with that. The kill came when the throat was exposed. But while you hate him, you love him also. You can't master enough focus with the divide inside you, and this is why Naruto-sama has surpassed you. Within him there is only unity. Sasuke was to blame, not Konoha. Furthermore, Kabuto was confident that Naruto-sama could support the boy once more if he broke a little. It was now preferable to go back before Naruto-sama's shift ended. In order to counterbalance the deteriorating, aching body and discovering that you have outlived almost everyone, including friends, allies, and enemies, Sandaime Tsuchikage Onoki of both scales was an elderly man. A small army of scribes who completed his paperwork as directed by him was one of the privileges he had claimed. He knew he could trust them completely because they were all retired Junin from his village who had served on active duty before becoming injured or too old. He now only uses his own hand to sign the documents. This was significant. In order to ensure that there was no discernible change in the paper's color, a careful hand painted an ancient document white with correction fluid deep within the earth's interior, paying particular attention to the crevices and nooks left around and inside the kanji of Onoki's name. Morimoto Tomomi's assassination. B-class Kakuzu is the recipient. General details. Because Tsuchikage candidate Deidara, Junin, register Idaho 015611, is so emotionally dependent on Morimoto Tomomi, Chunin, register IDO 15652. This person should be viewed as a liability to the security of Iwagakure no Sato. Codependency, broadly defined, is the reliance on another person's needs or control, frequently manifested through excessive compliance or control behaviors. Refer to the following file for more details on the criteria used in the decision-making process. Psychological assessments, Deidara, IDO 15611. Minimum conditions. In order to implicate a foreign village or a known missing nin, Morimoto Tomomi must die within 3 days of accepting this mission. Remittance payment for a standard B-class assassination will be made following the presentation of proof of death. No receipt will be provided because the mission is confidential. Affixed a signature Onoki Sandaime Tsuchikage. An explosive had been prepared in the country of Earth, and the fuse was gradually burning shorter and shorter. Although Naruto had landed in Tea Country, he departed by sea. The Sea Sprite was a fast-moving tourist vessel that would cut the curve of the Tea Country foreland and transport them from Makima to a city in Fire Country close to the borderlands that separated them from Water Country's sphere of influence. Even though he had previously been on ships, primarily during his brief tenure as Jiraiya's apprentice, it was still novel enough that he dashed to the bow of the ship to confront the wind and the waves. The entire world was blue and white on this lovely day, with the deep blue sea with whitecap waves below him and the sky and fluffy clouds above. Naruto spread his arms as the wind pushed his back as if it had the strength to raise him. He yelled to the person behind him, "One day I'm going to fly over the wind and the waves." The shinobi were the only ones hiding among the tourists to take advantage of the space and privacy because it was a little chilly and everyone was huddled under the deck. After saying, "Be careful, Naruto-sama," Kabuto moved to stand next to him. Tsubaki-chan wasn't on duty for once, and Naruto pondered whether his friend had abandoned her by using a clone. He was aware that she had good intentions and was only concerned about him and other things, but it was really hard to talk to her while she was listening to everything. Neither Kabuto nor Sasuke, nor apparently Sai, were particularly forthcoming. Kabuto said softly, "Not one day," and Naruto turned to ask if he knew any really cool wind jutsu that caused people to fly. However, Kabuto was not looking at him at all. Instead, he was looking northeast, far away from even the best-looking glass. That was where Konoha was. He was referring to Danzo when he said, "Not just one day when the plans have reached their completion, but 3 days from now." He shared Iruka-sensei's pearls of wisdom, saying, "Yes, procrastination is a bad habit. Don't put off doing what you can do today until tomorrow." When he thought, who knows how many people's lives he's ruining even now? A lick of fire swept over his chakra, but he pushed it back and frowned. Actually, Kyuubi had been quite active recently. Why was the furball acting that way? "Naruto-sama, I would advise you," Kabuto said in a voice that was somewhat insistent, but also, he assumed, he didn't know, the same voice that Naruto had used Ebisu and a few other guys use when they spoke to Sandaime Jiji and now Tsunade Bachan obedient. Despite Jiraiya's complaints, he actually liked it that way. Naruto's vocabulary had significantly increased since Jiraiya had taught him as a student, but the terms subservient and deferential had not yet appeared in his thesaurus. Naruto was about to respond when he said, "Sasuke is precious to you, your village is precious to you. This is true, right?" But Kabuto wasn't finished yet. His sheepish smile was similar to the one he had given during the Chunin exams when he acknowledged how many times he had failed the tests. "Then don't let Sasuke be there when we accost Danzo. In fact, it might be better if you weren't there either." Even though Naruto had experienced strong kinship at the time, he didn't like it. He grumbled, "Why not? And don't smile if you don't mean it, that's almost as creepy as size." Even though Kabuto's smile wasn't quite as creepy as size. At least he knew how to use his face and didn't appear to be thinking about axe murder. Without a smile, Kabuto said, "Am I your precious person, Naruto-sama?" His intense expression returned, just as it had when he had turned to face Konoha. "Of course," said Naruto. "It wasn't as if you went around making friends just for fun. He was always serious." Naruto couldn't read the amusing flutter in Kabuto's eyes as he asked, "Would you deceive me knowingly?" "Of course not," he angrily disputed. "Trust me, please. Naruto-sama, you are better off not meeting Danzo. He can be very garrulous when it suits him." Naruto was momentarily sidetracked by the question of what garrulous meant, but then Tsubaki-chan approached him, accompanied by a sullen Sasuke. Sasuke was pale like a ghost and his eyes had dark shadows, like he hadn't slept a wink last night. "Okay, I guess Sasuke's been really weird anyway," he said. "And Sai too, what you said to him anyway?" He inquired. Sai had not truly renounced Danzo, but he was also not protesting anything, so he was in a weird state of limbo. In fact, he appeared to have been struck over the head by a large hammer. As he walked around, he was giving Naruto some amusing looks while frantically taking notes in his book using regular ink. After Kabuto said, "Maybe you should ask him, I'm certain he would welcome a private conversation with you, Naruto-sama," Tsubaki-chan and Sasuke appeared. Sasuke avoiding his eyes as much as possible. They were getting closer to Konoha with the wind at their back. Many academics hypothesized that Jubi had been the negativity undivided and that the Sage of Six Paths had broken it down to its most basic elements, making the tailed beasts the embodiment of negative emotions that resulted from the sinful humankind's bad karma. According to their theory, Kyuubi represented hatred. Of course, it was utter nonsense, but what else could one expect from the ferocious ants? Rikudo Sennin had been dead for 2 millennia, and their father had been the only person worth anything. Kurama could sense negative emotions, it was true, but this fact hadn't made his current imprisonment any more comfortable. He was genuinely able to sympathize with Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto had been a baby whose opinion no one had cared about, in contrast to Uchiha Madara, who had simply taken control of him and called him a weapon, Senju Hashirama, who had sealed him into his wife, Uzumaki Mido, who had assisted her husband and chained him, and Uzumaki Kushina, who had made an informed choice and accepted her duty as his prison. Naruto was nearly as trapped as Kurama, who had just been pushed into him like a newborn in post-Kyuubi Konoha. Kurama, however, had half of his chakra violently torn away from him because he was tired of the Jinchuriki and the Jubi-damned village that the Uchiha and Senju had created. His current Jinchuriki was the son of the man who had done it, and the Shinigami's seal would ensure that if the little insect died with the seal still whole, he would also perish. The hatred Kurama had for Naruto far outweighed any little sympathy he had for him. No, he wasn't the epitome of hatred, but he was certainly living up to his reputation, and just when he had given up, Naruto had devised a brand new, intriguing method to stoke those fires. A cult of Jinchuriki. A religion that had declared Yondaime Hokage a saint and now claimed Rikudo Sennin as well. A religion that beatified those despised human cages, his dad. He had always taken advantage of any chance to control Naruto by inciting his anger and letting his power within his chakra consume the boy. He was extremely frustrated that although humans were capable of rage, this one simply refused to give in to it completely. He had now increased his efforts, looking for even the slightest gap, but Naruto had a new sense of security in his own strength, something that could not be described as serenity. That prevented him from becoming angry, even when he faced the damnable Uchiha. Kurama hurled himself against his prison's gates, cursing Amino Iruka, Haku, Uchiha Sasuke, Yondaime Hokage, and Shiki Fujin. "You jerk, I won't allow you to harm Iruka any longer." A person can develop true strength when they have something significant they wish to safeguard. "Even if I beat you to within an inch of your life, I won't let you go." Kurama wasn't yet defeated, but Naruto had discovered something that shouldn't have been possible for him to know. Even if it meant their deaths, he was going to prevail in this religious argument. Even though Migiwa wasn't the largest city Naruto had ever seen, it seemed to be the most vibrant and lively from the ship's deck where his group had been transported. The capital of the Fire Country was larger, but it had been a very stuffy place, with kidney-shaped ponds, temples with ornamental tower pavilions, and homes with roofs that were decorated and supported by pillars. Despite being even larger, that one city in Water Country had slums and a rather depressing appearance, resembling a wet puppy that you would take in from the rain and feed. There was a large fish market next to the harbor, busy-looking streets with roofs so close to one another that he would hardly have to hop from one to the other, and signboards and banderoles in vivid red, deep blue, and some really eye-catching neon colors in Migiwa. Naruto was immediately enamored with the city's homely appearance. Unfortunately, they were too busy to stay for a day or two. Danzo was impatient. Clutching his shirt over his heart, Naruto sang, "La la la, come morning, come day. I wish in me heart it was Sunday," as he marched down the landing plank to the wharf. Miso for breakfast all week long, and sweet ramen on a Sunday. Unfortunately, the ship only served basic breakfast, but they could definitely get some ramen here. Sasuke complained, "I thought it was supposed to be sake, Dobi," as he followed Naruto. Naruto gave a headshake. "No way, I'm much too young to drink." "They didn't let you do that in auto, did they? Because it's really bad for your liver, you know," he said with concern, being an even more careless responsible adult than Ero-sensei would be typical of Orochimaru. "There is nothing wrong with my liver," Sasuke yelled. His face flushed. "Don't be stupid, of course I didn't." Sai looked perplexed as he cocked his head, but he hardly ever looked away. He questioned, "What if I like miso better?" There was more for him, but Naruto hung his head sorrowfully over his pagan preferences. "Then we can steal each other's breakfast all the week. It works out in the end," he added. Sai pulled out his book once more and began rhyming that, but he was unsuccessful. Naruto saw that despite having his face in the book, he didn't bump into anything or anyone when he got back. He was going to insist that Ero-sensei teach him how to do that because it would be awesome. However, Tsubaki-chan most likely knew the trick as well, so perhaps he didn't have to wait. As they strolled down the street, someone said something kind and courteous to Tsubaki about having two adorable sons, and then inquired as to whether the two pale-haired people were her nephews or cousins. Sasuke abruptly stiffened, but Naruto wasn't really paying attention to the small talk because his eyes were searching the streets for ramen stands. Bright and angry, he hissed at Naruto, "You," and gripped his neck over the seal that protruded from his pale skin. It was so unexpected that Naruto stumbled when he turned to face Sasuke and said, "I think she would rather claim you were wholesome." He said, Thanks. What?" But Sasuke averted his gaze. Sai asked, "How being wholesome works?" Naruto was already aware that his inquiries frequently included odd or inappropriate side orders, but this was beginning to raise suspicions. Breakfast as miso and rice, served with a side of mutual angst. He was going to investigate the matter that was bothering Sasuke and Sai. "So you protect the roots of the tree. What have you done that protects Konoha?" "I have killed Konoha's enemies. You believe that makes you necessary? Even green genin can kill for Konoha?" Running steadily, Sai was ahead of Taiki and behind Sasuke. They were heading toward a green line at the horizon along an ancient gravel road that wound between gently sloping hillsides, with only a few wooden houses and small streams to mark their path. He should flee as soon as they arrived at Konoha's security zone and quickly alert Danzo-sama. Should he? Sai was not accustomed to being uncertain of his responsibilities. He had an obligation to obey, but to whom? He was most uneasy when working with contradictory, insufficient information. Tsubaki had stood in front of Sasuke, with Uzumaki Naruto taking the point and Kabuto at her right. Naruto's superior was most likely Tsubaki. Although she was a Junin and Naruto was only a genin, she had been sent to help as a backup. Despite her right to express her doubts, she respected Naruto's judgment about Kabuto, Sasuke, and Sai himself. She should have known better that the undefined chain of command was dangerous in the field, but she managed to make it seem simple. Sai was positive that she was fire-type, but the Kiri defector had called her disposition and muttered something about water elemental chakra. Kabuto quickly diverted his attention from Sai's main focus by turning his head. Although he was unsure of the precise boundaries of the man's abilities at the moment, it was evident that the traitor was clearly more skilled and powerful than Sai. Possibly all of them, with the possible exception of Naruto and Taiki, because the Jinchuriki's stated power levels varied too much for him to get a reliable estimate, and he was unaware of Taiki's full range of abilities. "Why don't you talk to him?" Kabuto asked, and Sai had to forcefully relax his shoulders to avoid making a grimace due to the questioning tone in his voice. The tone made him want to argue even when there was nothing to argue against, despite the fact that he had been trained to resist the natural urge to recoil after being physically harmed. "I am a tool to protect Konoha. You have nothing else to say?" Then again, capacity to reason isn't in high demand in Root, now is it? Sandame disbanded Root. Sai, he decided that to strip humanity from Konoha is to strip Konoha from Konoha, so what are you protecting? His stride lengthened as he called the Jinchuriki's name, Naruto, and Naruto turned his head. Smiling Sai was once again taken aback by that constant joy. Even though the Jinchuriki produced the best high danger and high destruction assassins, he couldn't see Naruto in that role. Naruto jumped over a small tree that had fallen across the road, then grabbed a branch and easily threw the trunk to the side of the road. Yeah. What is it? He asked. His rhythm had hardly broken at all when he said, "There, now it isn't going to bother people." Why had he bothered? Sai wondered. Naruto groaned as Sai began. "You were wholesome." He didn't allow that to deter him. He inquired, "Are you still useful to Konoha?" Naruto snorted and tilted his head to the side. He boasted, "Obviously I'm totally devastating, like those orange, poisonous toads. They're cool and so is their jutsu." And Sai recalled that the most dangerous animals in nature were those with the brightest colors. He turned to face the gentle and laid-back Kabuto, who referred to him as Naruto-sama, and Sasuke, who, surprisingly, glared daggers at him without protesting. He would have vowed a few days ago that those two would only come back to Konoha in body bags or chains. Wasn't the enemy dead when they were no longer an enemy? What if the individual wasn't? Vision that doesn't make you happy, doesn't make you productive member of the village, or even somehat proficient in anything more subtle than outright slaughter. Vision that Konoha has rejected once already. Vision of Danzo. If you haven't got it in you to be angry for being used, are you angry then for being wasted? I don't know what wholesome issues you have here, but real ninja aren't controlling jerks. I promise you, the ones who keep saying that people are tools are the biggest hypocrites. Just look at Zabuza, who claimed that he wanted to overthrow the Mizukage because he was a tyrant. Then, for rebellion money, he became an enforcer for another tyrant. Seriously, what the hell? Naruto asked, raising his face in the air as though to seek a higher power's intervention. But then his features softened and gentled. At least he regretted in the end. Trying to have the last word with Naruto is like having a lunch with a tiger. The food may be good, but the tiger always eats the last. Although he wasn't naturally vicious, Naruto was occasionally prepared to make an exception. Makima's Yakuza could have attested to that. The sight of two wolves and a saber-toothed sheep entering a diner was almost comical. By the time the heavy, ominous clouds began to assemble in the sky, they had already traveled quite a distance. It wasn't quite dark yet, and they had the option to continue when they came upon an old barn that was partially filled with hay. However, Tsubaki-chan ordered them to stop, and Naruto was more than happy to comply because he didn't want to sleep under a tree in the rain. He decided that Sasuke and his problems were enough to bite him that night, so he ignored Sai's muttering about a confused chain of command. When it began to rain, Sasuke left the area and went into a nearby forest, but he was too small to stay there and brood correct numbers. Because Sasuke's wetness was his problem and not a reason to postpone the conversation, Naruto pursued him. He discovered his dark, sullen teammate slouching and hanging his head beneath a buna tree. When Naruto leapt beneath the leaves, he was feeling rather gloomy and, although he wasn't exactly cold, water was streaming down his neck and back. Then he gave Sasuke a closer look. He pressed against the tree and tried to say, "So, nice weather." It was a plant, not an umbrella, but it helped shield him from some of the rain. Even though Sasuke was dripping more than Naruto, he still managed to look contemptuous by saying, "HN." Naruto became irritable and flushed. Sasuke already knew that the filter between his mouth and brain was somewhat broken, so it was a stupid thing to say. Naruto kicked a patch of grass that had never hurt him, saying, "Look, I'm trying to have a conversation here, and you are the one too dumb to come in from the rain. Asshole." He didn't even know why he suddenly became so shy and anxious. Things weren't this awkward before. After all, Sasuke wasn't going to flee again, was he? All shyness vanished in an instant when the jerk said, "Asshole? Is that the best you can come up with? So he wanted to play it that way?" Naruto could deliver, all right. Bootlegger. Nitwitted bastard of a freshwater pirate and a scabby mule with the brains of an oyster with shits that was dropped on its head as a baby. Sasuke paused for a good, long time before mouthing, "What?" Naruto watched Sasuke's puzzled expression and smiled. Hey, he didn't get to witness the Ice Prince's daily jaw-dropping. Naruto nodded wisely and said, "Jiraiya's sensei spends a lot of time at red light districts. Lots and lots of time." He had discovered that those individuals had some amusing curses once all references to sex acts and between legs body parts were removed. Additionally, he had learned more than 50 words for female parts, about half of which were too complicated for Sakura-chan to read if she came across a fruit stand, flower shop, or fishwife's stand. The other half were something he didn't even want to think aloud for fear that Tsubaki-chan might hear. It was very difficult to have a conversation about anything a few hundred years ago without unintentionally bringing up at least two of the numerous terms for the female parts. Who, for heaven's sake, equates a temple with a geisha house and purse for, well, that? Sasuke started, so you say I'm one of your precious people, and chase after me, but Naruto could clearly hear the quotation marks in his voice even though he wasn't quite dexterous enough to use his fingers to make them. His voice was more sarcastic than the water dripping from the tree. What if I say I can't stop caring for my brother? He asked. Naruto complained, that bastard, and the blazing otherness inside him licked his chakra once more like a ravenous dog. He gave it a hard kick. Even though Sasuke was a bastard and an idiot, he needed him right now and had no time for pointless personal drama. Sasuke questioned, you don't think I'm disgusting? He was still trying, but failing miserably, to sound mean and cold. The sun was low and obscured by dense, dark clouds, making it difficult for Naruto to see Sasuke's face. However, the way his misbehaving teammate hunched his shoulders made Naruto want to give Sasuke a hug. Since Sasuke would only punch him, he reconsidered. Then he went ahead and did it. Sasuke did give him a, what the, stop it, you idiot, punch, but it was a weak, feeble blow, and Naruto heard a tiny whine as he pictured ripping Itachi's heart from his chest with his bare fingers and blood all over the place. The red was like a thick, oppressive blanket. He was unable to recall how he suppressed the red this time, but when he regained consciousness, the raindrops that were falling on his skin were sizzling and they were both dry. By nature, Naruto was not a vicious person. A long time ago, Iruka-sensei had informed him that a true agreement was more than just two wolves and a sheep deciding what to eat for supper. Since he had only seen black and white images of the animals and, hey, his woolen clothing was orange, Naruto had agreed at that point, picturing the sheep in orange and feeling a great deal of pity for the poor creature. When Naruto gave Sasuke another hug because he was wide-eyed and appeared a little afraid, the simile suddenly broke out because he thought of Itachi. It was so dreadfully adorable that the mental image of woolly, bloody saber-tooth sheep Itachi was pretty absurd. Inside Naruto's head, sheep Itachi bleated and flitted its swirling, red eyes. He grinned. He was going to have dinner because he was hungry and wanted to invite Sasuke because he was that kind of generous. Even though Ero-sensei was a bit of a pervert and lazy, he was good. Naruto was going to train, and if Itachi didn't want to be eaten, then so be it. It was put to a vote, and now it was 2-1. Since Tsubaki was a hired killer, she didn't want to use the word evil carelessly. However, she recalled the Kyuubi's attack and felt comfortable labeling that creature as evil because of its terrifying chakra and unadulterated intent to kill. Every breath she took had been a struggle against freezing and fear, and it was all-pervading, malevolent, and thick in the air like the smoke and blood from the burning buildings. She watched his charge embrace the Uchiha while standing in the rain. Even in his rage, Naruto remained infinitely gentle, despite the boy's terrible anger radiating off him and bringing back painful memories. She turned back to the photo and said, I think we should leave, her tongue twitching awkwardly in her mouth. This made me think a little. Almost literally she recalled Naruto's beloved Iruka-sensei to the extent that references to Kakashi-sensei and Ero-sensei occasionally seemed almost like afterthoughts. Iruka-sensei always spoke first. She recalled Naruto's priceless bowls of ramen and how the boy could gobble up bowl after bowl of the bland instant variety. She recalled the old saying, a bowl of vegetables served with love is better than a 3-course meal served with hatred. Despite Naruto's constant complaints about vegetables, he continued to eat them because Iruka-sensei, who was always right, had taught him that they were an essential component of a shinobi's diet. A black and white shadow in the darkness. Sai questioned, shouldn't we keep guard in case he loses control of the Biju? Kabuto's hand drew a little bit closer to what was probably a sharp, pointy object, and Tsubaki was horrified to discover that she now approved of the man for that reason alone. They were hiding in the rain, far enough away that, provided they didn't start yelling, the two genin shouldn't see them. By deflecting the raindrops, Taiki was able to stay dry, leaving his clothes and hair slightly damp. Even though Kabuto appeared to have been thrown overboard while crossing the gulf, he still managed to look very dignified and regal despite the fact that he was not dry. Tsubaki questioned whether Sai needed some remedial weather desensitization training because he appeared as though he wouldn't have cared if someone had thrown him to the sea. Even her underwear was now wet and chafing as she moved, and she was cold with water streaming down her back. She said, let's go back, and began guiding her group back to the barn. No one is losing control here. No sense in getting even more wet than we already are. But how? Taiki inquired as he moved slowly and turned to face the area where the two boys vanished into the rain and tree shadows. Tsubaki smiles as she remembers the day she took this mission, the meal she and Iruka had at Ichiraku's, the warm sun, the flavorful broth, and the suffering she had now left behind. How can he feel like that and not do anything? She asks. And if there was still a trace of Kyuubi against the forest background, the bite felt almost safe, like the canned wasabi beans that had been her go-to comfort food since she was 10 years old. There are 2 men in Konoha, one of them is an academy teacher. The other is a ramen chef, and when we return I'm going to kiss them both. Idate didn't think highly of Morimoto Tomomi when he first met her. They graduated the same year, despite the fact that she was 2 years older than he was. He stood in front of a panel that examined his Junin evaluation results when she took her Chunin exams. She was obviously not a bad kunoichi, but she also had little chance of ever becoming a Junin. She wasn't the type to have personal drama. Period. She was trustworthy, the kind whose devotion to her village was unquestionable, who was good on missions, and who didn't bring her drama to the battlefield. She was a generally kind person who supported her friends and allies. She had the attractiveness of the girl next door. She was not the kind to attract the attention of a young genius. During Deidara's second mission as a Junin, she was one of the 2 Chunin assigned to him. The fact that they had been given false information made that mission an absolute disaster. There were 15 Kiri, Kumo, and AIM missing nin attempting to create a drug ring, 3 of whom were Junin level, as opposed to 4 Kiri missing nin. Yasu, the Chunin, was killed in battle, and Idate and Tomomi were captured and tortured for valuable information. The missing nin chose to soften Idate before working him over because he had more classified information and was probably the tough one as well. They agreed to sleep deprivation, a few beatings, and, of course, the psychological anguish of witnessing his comrades suffer and break in front of him. Neither on day 1 nor on day 2 did Tomomi break. On the 3rd day, they put drugs in her water, forcing the disgusting beverage down her throat while she tasted what had been done to it. After Tomomi's eyes crossed, an androgynous man the others called Osamu asked her, "We want dirt, little kunoichi. Dirt on your precious village. Have you ever been part of a political assassination?" Idate wasn't entirely sure he wasn't a she, but he was. Assassis. Tomomi sounded perplexed as she attempted to pronounce the word. Kill, Osamu told himself. Sounding disgusted, Idate was gagged and bound, unable to do anything but listen in. Prodigies and geniuses in the ninja world have a certain quality that may make being one unworthy. They are so different from their peers that they never fully comprehend the how and why of other people, though some are better at hiding this. Additionally, they frequently exhibit fragility in ways that aren't immediately apparent. Idate was too preoccupied with thinking about suicide to even consider escaping that day, instead wallowing in the shame of his failure, something he had never experienced before. Kill, sniffed Tomomi. My poor. I had red and orange and that white sword with the violet thing at the center, you know, zinnias. Clearly unimpressed by this admission, Osamu said flatly, "You killed your potted plant?" "I didn't mean to." Tomomi vehemently defended herself at this point. Deidara's gaping must have been evident even with the gag. They were so happy flowers. Maybe it's kinda difficult to tell with plants. And then there were my forget-me-nots. I sort of forgot to water them before I left for a mission. When I finally returned they were dead too. Tomomi talked endlessly about how she couldn't keep her flowers alive, mentioning the red spider lilies, lavenders, and gardenias. Osamu was the one who lost it and gave her a hard slap when she arrived at the bonsai tree that some overconfident idiot had given her as a birthday present. Guaranteed to make people talk. Oh yes. He or she. The drug vial was thrown against a wall. Now for the love of the great jade dragon, shut up. After that, they were led to their shared cell. They were chained to opposite walls so Idate could see Tomomi in pain but not touch or assist her, which was an additional act of cruelty. She drooped her head under the influence of drugs, but her eyes were much clearer when she lifted her face and the door was slammed shut. There was a ghost of a smile on her lips despite the bruises, blood, and clammy skin. It was obvious that that drink had not completely drained her of her intelligence. She told him, "I've never had a bonsai tree," she slurred, and Idate questioned whether he had understood her correctly. "Of course no one was stupid enough to give me one." "Why you claim to have one?" he inquired, astonished that he could find the matter interesting. Tomomi replied in a prim voice, "Well, it was obviously annoying them. It's the principle of the thing." Before laughing and ruining the effect. Even though the bark was brief and painful, it was the real deal, reaching her eyes, and Idate could only think, "Oh shishti, I'm in trouble now." Now how could he bear to see her tortured? What else could he do, though? At this point, she tossed him a senbon that was still smeared with her own blood from when she palmed it during the interrogation. "You are the better fighter, make it count," she stated for the first time. Idate followed Tomomi's instructions. It was clearly a good plan, he concluded. Like a thirsty man depends on water, Idate relied on this woman to keep him sane. Danzo would have been smart to take a cue from Onoki, who never hurt a hair on her head in spite of that fateful psychological evaluation.
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.